The snow hit sideways when Dad shoved my duffel onto the turnout. 11 days earlier, an army cardiologist had warned my heart might not survive the weekend. Now my 7-year-old stood crying beside me, while my parents drove off with my sister. In my fist was the scratched field watch. Wren had pulled from her backpack, the watch missing since the night my husband died. Bishop, my retired military working dog, pressed against my leg as the taillights vanished. I thought the storm was the danger. I was wrong. The danger was why all three of them recognized that watch. If you've ever been called the strong one, until people forgot you could be hurt too, stay with me. And if stories like mine mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stay through the end. That morning, 11 days into a hospital stay, I had spent most of my waking hours trying to shorten. I was sitting on the edge of the bed tying my own shoes when my daughter informed me I had violated hospital policy. Wren had taped a sheet of printer paper to the tray table in front of me. She had written "Mom Rest Zone" in purple crayon, underlined it 3 times, and drawn what I assumed was supposed to be a stop sign beside it. Her letters leaned downhill, the way they always did when she was concentrating harder on speed than spelling. I finished the knot anyway. She planted both hands on her hips. "You can only leave for bathroom emergencies." For the first time in several days, a laugh escaped before I had the strength to stop it. It pulled at the muscles between my ribs and made my heart feel suddenly too large inside my chest, but it was worth it. Is the hallway considered an emergency? Wren considered that with all the solemnity of a 7-year-old appointed by herself to a federal commission. No. She moved my shoes farther under the bed. The joke should have stayed a joke. Instead, as she turned back to rearrange the plastic cup beside my medication list, I noticed how carefully she was doing everything. My water straw pointed toward my right hand, because she had learned I was less likely to pull at the IV bruises on my left arm that way. My sweater was folded on the chair. The charger cord had been wrapped into a neat circle. She had even put 2 packs of crackers into the side pocket of my bag because, as she had told the nurse earlier, Mom sometimes forgot food when she got busy. 7-year-olds were supposed to make messes adults complained about. Mine had begun managing me. I watched her smooth the blanket over the empty part of the mattress and swallowed whatever comment had risen in my throat. I had spent most of Wren's life teaching her, without meaning to, that competence was the same thing as safety. I got things done. I didn't make people worry. I fixed problems before they had the chance to become somebody else's burden. Apparently, she had been taking notes. The cardiology team had cleared me to go home that morning, but nobody used the word recovered. 11 days earlier, I had collapsed after weeks of treating exhaustion, fever, and a pounding heartbeat like minor inconveniences that could be scheduled around work, laundry, school pickup, and every other item on a list that never stopped reproducing. The diagnosis had been acute myocarditis complicated by a ventricular arrhythmia. It had nothing to do with the service-related injuries that had ended my Army career 6 years earlier. My body had simply found a new way to insist that I stop. That first weekend, Lieutenant Colonel Elias Ward had spoken to my family while I drifted in and out beneath monitors and medication. By the time I was alert enough to understand how close things had come, his words had already settled over everyone else. There was a real possibility my heart would not carry me through the weekend. It did. Then came another week of telemetry, blood draws, medications, cautious walks, and medical people explaining that surviving something was not the same as being finished with it. By discharge day, I could cross the room without assistance if I moved slowly. That was progress. It was not permission to drive myself through Ute Pass, lift luggage, shovel snow, return to work, or behave as though nearly dying had been an administrative inconvenience. "Doctor," Ward went over the restrictions one last time. I listened and stored the essentials automatically, the way I once stored radio frequencies and coordinates. No driving, no strenuous activity, and call if the symptoms returned. He gave me the particular look doctors reserve for patients who are already planning which rule can be bent first. I looked away before he could add anything. My father handled the discharge logistics because that was what Frank Calloway did when something frightened him. He turned fear into lists, routes, departure times, gas levels, weather checks. My mother turned hers into blankets, food, questions about medication, and the kind of hovering that made every object within 3 feet of me feel inspected. Mallory, my younger sister, had become something else entirely. Gentle. That was the word that kept bothering me. She had spent the last several days lowering her voice when she entered my room, bringing coffee for Mom, sitting with Wren when I slept, and asking nurses whether there was anything I needed before asking me. Mallory had never been cruel to me as a default setting. That would have been easier to recognize. She could be affectionate, funny, helpless, infuriating, generous, and exhausting inside the same afternoon. But this version of her seemed to be moving around a bruise no one else could see. I told myself near death had shaken all of us. Mom kissed the top of my head and told me I had always been her tough girl. Dad said I would bounce back once I got home. Mallory smiled and added that, if anybody could handle this, it was me. 3 versions of the same compliment. I accepted them the same way I had accepted that compliment my entire life, with a small smile and no correction. Nadine brought Bishop to the hospital entrance shortly before we left. My neighbor had been keeping him while I was admitted, which meant she had spent 11 days insisting I stop apologizing for asking her to do something she had volunteered to do. Bishop spotted me through the glass doors before I reached him. 9 years old had put a little silver around his muzzle, but retirement had not altered the way his body organized itself around attention. He stood beside Nadine, ears forward, waiting. No whining, no lunging at the leash. Just that fixed Malinois stare that had made more than one new handler uncomfortable during my army years. When I came close enough, his tail struck Nadine's leg exactly twice. I lowered one hand. Bishop pressed his nose into my palm, then lifted his head and inspected the wheelchair, my discharge bag, Dad, Mom, Mallory, and finally me again. After years of working beside military people, whose inspections involved clipboards and consequences, I knew judgment when I saw it. Bishop appeared unconvinced by the hospital's decision to release me. Nadine must have seen the same thing in his face, because she covered a laugh with the back of her hand. She gave Dad the leash and reminded me that my refrigerator was stocked. I started to ask what I owed her. She pointed at the wheelchair. That ended the discussion. The humor lasted just long enough to make the morning feel normal. Outside, January had turned the foothills the color of old steel. The weather report had been worsening since dawn. Snow had begun in Colorado Springs as a thin scatter, nothing dramatic, but the mountains west of us had disappeared behind a thicker gray wall. Dad had been checking road conditions all morning. US 24 was still open, with restrictions tightening as the front moved through. We could have waited. I was the one who wanted to leave. At the time, all I wanted was my own bed, my own shower, Wren's crayons on the kitchen table, Bishop blocking the hallway at exactly the wrong angle. 11 days beneath fluorescent lights had stripped home down to its smallest details, and every one of them felt precious. Dad drove. Mom took the front passenger seat. Mallory sat behind Dad. Wren and I shared the other side of the back seat, and Bishop was secured in the cargo area behind us. My duffel sat at my feet because Dad had refused to let me carry it. For the first half hour, the drive settled into the muted rhythm of bad weather. Tires whispered over wet pavement. Wipers scraped back and forth. The snow became thicker as Colorado Springs dropped behind us, and the highway began climbing west. Wren leaned against my arm, careful not to put too much weight on me, even asleep for a few minutes. She seemed to remember that I was breakable. Mom turned twice to ask if I was warm enough. Mallory passed Wren a snack without being asked. Dad reduced speed. Nothing about those things should have become sinister in memory. That was what made betrayal so difficult to organize afterward. The people who hurt you did not spend every preceding minute sharpening knives. Sometimes they adjusted the heater for you. Sometimes they remembered which crackers your child liked. Wren woke fully somewhere past the denser edge of town and began digging through the front pocket of her backpack. Her backpack was blue, covered in tiny yellow stars, and one permanent streak of pink marker near the zipper. She had taken it to the hospital almost every day because it held crayons, a paperback she mostly pretended to read herself, 2 toy horses, and an unreasonable number of stickers. She pulled out a folded drawing first, then a granola bar wrapper I made a mental note to throw away. Then her fingers closed around something metal. Oh, that little sound changed my life. Wren turned the object over in her palm and looked at me. "Mom, is this yours?" "Auntie dropped it by your bed." The highway noise seemed to recede. The watch lay across her small hand, with the face tilted toward me. Brown leather strap, darkened with age near the buckle. Stainless steel case. A pale scratch crossing the crystal at an angle just below the 12. I knew that scratch. Gavin had put it there while replacing a starter on Marcus's truck, years before Wren was born. He had been irritated about it for exactly 2 days, and then refused to replace the crystal because, according to him, a watch that never got scratched belonged to a man who never did anything. Near the strap was a tiny notch where he had punched an extra hole himself after losing weight one summer. My fingers went cold before the rest of me did. I took the watch from Wren. The leather felt dry and familiar. For 4 years I had believed it was gone. After Gavin's crash, his wallet had come back. His wedding ring, his keys, a few other personal effects, not the watch. I had asked about it once in the fog of those first days, and had been told it had not been recovered. I had accepted that because grief taught you to accept strange absences. A glove, a watch, a receipt. The last cup someone drank from. You could spend a lifetime building meaning around what remained or destroy yourself, trying to catalog what didn't. I had chosen not to catalog. Until that moment, across from me, Mallory's face lost color. It was not subtle. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Mom turned around so quickly, her seatbelt locked against her shoulder. Dad's eyes moved to the rearview mirror. 3 reactions. Not one person asked what Wren was holding. That was the first thing that frightened me. I looked back down at the face of Gavin's watch, then at my sister. The question came out quiet. "Where did you get this?" Mallory's gaze flicked to Wren before returning to me. She said it only looked like Gavin's. I rubbed my thumb over the scratch in the crystal. I had spent 14 years knowing Gavin in one form or another. I had watched him wear that watch to work, to our wedding rehearsal, to the hospital the day Wren was born. I knew the notch in the strap because I had watched him make it at the kitchen counter and complain that the leather punch I bought was useless. "It's his." No one answered immediately. Outside, snow began sticking to the shoulder. Mallory changed her explanation. Maybe Gavin had left it at Mom and Dad's place years ago. Maybe she had picked it up there without remembering. Mom jumped in too quickly, agreeing that it was possible, then referring to a Christmas visit that had happened after Gavin died. The mistake was tiny. That made it worse. Her voice stopped mid-sentence. She faced forward again. Dad increased the wiper speed. I could hear my pulse in my ears, an ugly awareness after 11 days of being trained to notice every irregular beat. I glanced at Wren. She was watching the adults with the stillness children develop when they understand the room has changed, but not why. That should have been the moment I stopped. There were good reasons to stop. I had just left a cardiac unit. My daughter was beside me. The weather was worsening. Whatever answer existed had waited 4 years, and could have waited another hour. I knew all of that. I kept asking anyway. Not because the watch mattered more than Wren. Not because I thought the car was the right place to unravel Gavin's death. I simply had 4 years of grief sitting in my palm, and 3 people I loved had reacted to it like they had been caught beside an open grave. I asked Mallory why Wren had seen the watch fall beside my hospital bed. She said she did not know. I asked whether she had brought it to the hospital. She insisted I was making too much of an old object. Dad told me my medication and exhaustion were getting the better of me. He said we could discuss it later, after I had rested. The language was calm. That was Dad's specialty. He could make control sound like common sense. I looked at his eyes in the mirror. I'll call Marcus when we get home. Dad's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Mallory stopped moving. Mom turned toward the window. Marcus was Gavin's older brother. We had not been close for years. Grief had done that, among other things. But he had once tried to tell me something about Gavin's final night that I had refused to hear. I had not thought about that conversation in a long time. Apparently, my family had. Dad said my name once, warning threaded through it. I tucked the watch into my palm. I'm not doing this in the car. I said I'll call him when we get home. I meant that as de-escalation. Maybe it should have come 20 minutes earlier. The road climbed into heavier snow. Visibility shortened. The windshield became a narrow rectangle of white and gray, the edges constantly erased by the wipers. About 10 minutes later, Dad turned off the highway into Pine Ridge Turnout. It was a small, seasonal pull-off, mostly buried now, with a low barrier along one side and a closed information shelter farther back. In better weather, people stopped there for the view. There was no view that afternoon, only blowing snow. Dad put the SUV in park. He said I was upsetting Ren, that I was not thinking clearly after the hospital, and that he was not driving another mile until I handed the watch back to Mallory and stopped making accusations. I stared at him. Back? The word escaped before I could keep it inside. Dad did not answer that part. Instead, he got out. By the time I opened my door, he had pulled my duffel from the rear cargo area and set it in the snow beside the SUV. For one suspended second, I could not understand what he meant by the gesture. Then I did. If I would not cooperate, he would use the ride home against me. Something inside me went very still. I stepped out to retrieve the bag. Cold struck through my hospital clothes immediately. Not pain yet, just shock. Wind shoved snow against my face and caught beneath my coat. Behind me, I heard a seatbelt click. Ren. I turned. She had climbed out after me, backpack still over one shoulder. No, sweetheart. Get back in with Grandma. Bishop was already shifting in the rear compartment, responding to the open doors and my movement. With voices rising and adults moving around the vehicle, I gave him a simple command and brought him out rather than leave him loose inside a car where nobody but me handled him regularly. He came straight to my left side. Ren moved toward the rear passenger door. I reached for her shoulder to guide her back. Mallory got there first. She pulled the door inward. Ren's glove touched the handle. The lock clicked. I looked through the glass at my sister. Her face had changed again. Not pale now, but tight, almost desperate. She told Dad to drive for a few minutes, just long enough for me to calm down and stop turning everything into a crisis. The irony would have been funny in another lifetime. Mom twisted in her seat. She told Dad not to leave Ren outside. I raised my voice only once. Take her with you. Ren looked from me to the locked door. Dad's brake lights glowed red through the snow. For 1 second, I thought that would be the end of it. He would swear, unlock the doors, pull Ren inside, and we would all spend the rest of the drive home, pretending we had not crossed some invisible line. Instead, the SUV moved, slowly at first, then faster. I did not run after it. My heart had begun hammering hard enough that the hospital instructions seemed to rise in my mind one by one. No exertion. Stop if dizzy. Call for help if symptoms returned. Ren took 1 step toward the road. Bishop moved with her. I caught the back of her coat. The SUV's taillights blurred in the blowing snow. Mom's face appeared for a moment through the rear window. Then the vehicle rounded the bend and disappeared. Ren started crying without making much sound. Her mouth trembled. She looked up at me as though I could explain what had just happened. I could not. Bishop pressed his shoulder against my leg. The watch was still in my fist. Only then did something Dad had said earlier return, with a clarity sharper than the cold. He had not said, "Give me the watch." He had not asked whose it was. He had not asked why I cared about it. He had said, "Give it back to your sister." Dad hadn't asked what I was holding. He had told me to give it back. That meant Mallory wasn't the only one who knew where Gavin's watch had been. For several seconds after the SUV disappeared, I kept looking at the bend in the road, as if refusing to blink might force the red taillights to come back. They did not. Snow swept across the turnout in white sheets, erasing the tire tracks almost as quickly as Dad had made them. Wind came over the ridge hard enough to push against my shoulders. Wren stood beside me with her backpack hanging crookedly from one arm, her face pinched and wet beneath the hood of her coat. Bishop pressed close to my left leg, waiting for a command. The watch was still trapped in my fist. I shoved it into the zippered inside pocket of my coat. Whatever it meant could wait. Wren could not. The turnout had looked small from inside the SUV. Outside, with visibility collapsing, it felt exposed in every direction. The information shelter Dad had stopped near was closed for the season, but one side of the low structure and a concrete barrier offered partial protection from the wind. It was less than 30 yards away. Under normal circumstances, I would have covered that distance without noticing it. That afternoon, it might as well have been a hill. My legs felt hollow before we had gone 10 steps. The cardiology team had warned me what exertion could do. My heart had spent 11 days proving it no longer cared what I thought I was capable of. By the time I got Wren behind the barrier, I could feel the rhythm in my chest misbehaving again. Not dramatic enough to knock me down, but fast and uneven, followed by pauses that made my lungs instinctively reach for more air. I made Wren crouch beside me with her back to the wind. Her coat was good enough for walking from a heated car into a house. It was not snow gear. She had gloves and boots, but no snow pants, and the fine powder blowing around the shelter was already collecting in the folds of her jeans and melting where it touched warmth. I checked her hood, pulled the zipper higher beneath her chin, and wrapped the loose end of my scarf around her neck. She kept looking toward the road. "Grandpa's coming back, right?" I had spent her entire life trying to make my answers feel solid. That time I could not. "I don't know." Her eyes snapped to mine. I had never realized how frightening uncertainty sounded in my own voice until I saw it reach my daughter. Bishop settled against Wren when I gave him the command, his body blocking part of the wind. He had been retired long enough that most people saw only an aging Belgian Malinois with gray beginning around his muzzle. I still saw the discipline beneath it. Stay meant stay. He did not need to understand why. My phone was in the inside pocket on the other side of my coat. The screen lit when I pulled it out, but the signal indicator shifted between 1 bar and none. I called 911 anyway. The connection broke twice before a dispatcher came through clearly enough for me to understand her. I forced myself to slow down. Route first. Direction of travel. Seasonal turnout west of Colorado Springs. Somewhere along the Ute Pass corridor. I described the closed information shelter, the barrier, what I remembered from the road before Dad pulled off. I told her I had a 7-year-old with me, that I had been discharged from cardiac care that morning, and that the weather was deteriorating quickly. She started asking me to confirm landmarks. The line went dead. For a second I stared at the screen like anger could create a cell tower. I called again. Nothing. Again. This time, the emergency call connected long enough for another voice to answer. My hands had started shaking so hard that tapping the screen took 2 attempts. I gave my name again, then Wren's. I repeated the highway. Halfway through explaining the turnout, the edges of my vision darkened. I lowered myself against the concrete, rather than risk falling on her. Wren grabbed my sleeve. "Mom?" I hated the fear in that one word. There are habits you carry out of the army long after you stop wearing the uniform. One of mine was breaking a bad situation into tasks small enough that panic could not swallow them. Stay off the roadway. Stay behind cover. Keep Ren dry. Keep her awake. Preserve the phone. Wait for help. That list would have been comforting once. Instead, I looked at my daughter and understood that the most important thing I could give her was not another performance. I'm scared too, I told her. And I need help. She stared at me. Then she nodded. Something changed in her shoulders. Not relief exactly. More like permission. The phone connected again. My voice was getting weaker, and when the dispatcher asked questions that required only simple answers, I put the phone close to Ren. She told them she was 7. She said the car had been dark-colored. She said she could see a sign with snow stuck over some of the letters. When asked whether we were near traffic, she looked toward the highway and said the cars sounded far away even when she could not see them. She did not become brave in the polished way adults like to describe children afterward. She cried between answers. She forgot our house number. She asked me twice whether she had said something wrong. When the connection failed again, she buried her face against Bishop's neck. I kept one gloved hand against the back of her coat. The first 20 minutes passed in pieces. At least I think they did. Time in the cold did strange things. I watched the phone clock when I could, but every minute felt disconnected from the one before it. Snow accumulated along the edge of the barrier. The wind shifted enough that I moved Ren 2 feet closer to the shelter wall. Bishop followed without hesitation and settled against her legs. I had spent years working around dogs trained to ignore discomfort when given a task. Retirement had softened Bishop in ordinary ways. He slept longer, stole warm spots in the house, and had developed a deeply unfair interest in cheese. But the old steadiness remained. He did not pace. He did not bark into the storm. He stayed. That was all. It was enough. My father's SUV did not return. At some point, Ren stopped asking when it would. That frightened me more. She became quieter first. Then she fumbled when she tried to pull her glove back over her fingers. The glove dropped into the snow, and she looked at it for several seconds before reaching. I grabbed it first. Her movements were losing their neatness. "Ren, look at me." She did, but slowly. Her cheeks were red beneath a waxy paleness spreading around her mouth. Snow had melted into the knees of her jeans where she had knelt earlier. She told me she was not cold anymore. Every part of me tightened. Children saying they were no longer cold in conditions like those was not comforting. I pulled her against me and Bishop at the same time, trying to make one small pocket of warmth out of 3 bodies. My own coat had begun to feel damp at the shoulders. My fingertips had lost their clean sensation. Worse was the heavy pressure beneath my breastbone and the irregular flutter that kept interrupting it. The doctor's warning had been specific. No unnecessary exertion, no exposure, call for symptoms. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 11 days of doctors guarding my heart from stares, stress, and overconfidence. And before sunset, my own family had placed me outdoors in a mountain storm. The laugh never made it out. Ren's head had begun leaning against Bishop. I nudged her. She opened her eyes. A few minutes later, they closed again. That was when fear stopped feeling like fear and became something sharper. I made her tell me what color her classroom door was. I asked what she wanted for dinner when we got home. I reminded her that Bishop hated peas, which was not true, because Bishop would eat almost anything if given permission. She corrected me the first time. 10 minutes later, she did not bother. I kept talking anyway. The watch inside my coat pressed against my ribs whenever I moved. I stopped thinking about it entirely. That surprised me later. 4 years of unanswered grief had appeared in my daughter's backpack, and in the storm it became nothing more than a piece of metal in a pocket. Whatever Mallory had hidden, whatever my parents knew, none of it mattered while Ren's fingers were turning clumsy inside mine. I would have thrown the watch into the snow if doing so could have made my daughter warm, but no one was there demanding it anymore. They had already driven away. The phone vibrated once. I nearly dropped it. A text from emergency services had come through automatically, confirming an active incident and advising us to remain where we were if safe. I could not tell whether my replies were leaving my phone, so I stopped wasting battery. Bishop shifted suddenly. My first thought was that he had heard the SUV returning. He had not. He was looking at me. The dog rose, moved away from Ren just far enough to press his shoulder hard against my chest and thigh, then pushed back toward her. I tried to adjust my position and discovered that my body did not respond as quickly as I expected. I had been drifting. That realization did not come as a sentence in my head. It came as Bishop's weight, Ren's hood against my arm, and the missing seconds I could not account for. I forced my eyes open. The world had narrowed to the shelter wall, the concrete beneath me, and Ren's breathing. "I need you awake, baby." Her eyelids fluttered. She whispered that she was tired. I told her I knew. I did not tell her everything would be fine. I had made too many promises in my life based on the belief that my strength could guarantee an outcome. Instead, I held her tighter and told her help knew where we were. That was true. Approximately 70 minutes after my first successful 911 connection, red and white light appeared through the snow. For several seconds I thought my brain had invented it. Then Bishop stood, not running, not pulling away, just alert. A second set of lights emerged behind the first. The vehicles were moving slowly along the corridor, stopping at pull-offs as responders worked outward from the approximate location the emergency call had provided. I tried to stand. My knees failed. I stayed where I was. That may have been the first sensible decision I made all day. The responders came to us. Everything afterward moved faster than my memory could organize. Reflective jackets. A thermal blanket opened with a metallic crackle. Somebody kneeling in front of Ren. Questions I could answer, then questions I could not. My daughter being lifted, while she protested weakly that Bishop had to come too. A medic assuring her the dog was not being left behind. Those words nearly undid me. Inside the ambulance, they started warming Ren, before I understood how cold she had actually become. Her temperature was low enough that the medic's face changed when he read it. Later, in the hospital, I learned the number had settled just under 32 degrees Celsius when they obtained a reliable core reading. Ren's reliable core temperature settled just under 32 degrees Celsius. The hospital called it moderate hypothermia. They rewarmed her carefully and watched her heart and oxygen, while my own unstable rhythm forced the staff to treat us in separate rooms for a time. I hated that separation, but I did not have the strength to fight it physically. All I could do was keep asking for updates until they could bring us back together. The medical staff did not argue with me for long. They explained what needed to happen, arranged updates, and kept Ren under observation, while my own cardiology team dealt with the fact that their newly discharged patient had returned cold, exhausted, and throwing irregular beats on a monitor. The hospital ceiling looked exactly the same as it had that morning. That felt cruel. I had spent hours dreaming of home. By evening, I was back under fluorescent lights with new leads on my chest. Ren was the one I asked about until the nurse finally brought me enough information to let my lungs expand properly. Her temperature was climbing. She was awake. She had eaten a few spoonfuls of something warm. The doctors expected a full recovery. No sentence in my life had ever sounded better. When I was finally allowed to see her, she was wrapped in more blankets than seemed physically possible. Bishop had been checked, dried, and kept nearby through arrangements I barely followed. Somebody had found him a blanket, too. Ren looked at it and frowned. "His is too small." I stared at her. She was still pale. Her hair flattened strangely on one side, but the indignation in her voice was unmistakably hers. A staff member brought another blanket. Bishop ignored both of them until Ren was covered to her shoulders. Then he circled once and lay down beside the chair. The corner of my mouth lifted. It hurt. I let it. For maybe 30 seconds, the room contained nothing except my daughter, an old dog, and the ridiculous number of blankets required to satisfy a 7-year-old's sense of fairness. Then reality came back. A deputy needed an account of what had happened. So did medical staff, documenting how Ren had ended up exposed to the cold. The questions were handled carefully. Nobody marched into the room and interrogated us. Most of what I told them was taken later, after my heart settled enough for me to speak without setting off alarms. By then, Dad, Mallory, and Mom had already given versions of their own. Dad said I had demanded to get out. He described me as emotional, exhausted, and not thinking clearly after hospitalization. According to him, he had stopped because I insisted the drive could not continue while we were arguing. Mallory said they intended to return after everyone had time to calm down. Mom said less. I knew that because the deputy who summarized the accounts paused before mentioning hers. She had confirmed the stop and acknowledged that Ren had ended up outside, but she had avoided several of the sharper questions about how the doors were closed and why the SUV left. I listened without interrupting. The story Dad was telling was not completely invented. That made it more dangerous. I had opened the door. I had stepped out after he placed my duffel in the snow. I had refused to hand over the watch. I had continued asking questions when there were reasons to wait. Those things were true. So was the image I could not remove from my mind. Ren's glove against the rear door, Mallory pulling it shut, the lock engaging, me telling them to take my daughter. Later, when a clinician asked Ren a few basic questions with me present, my daughter did not provide a theory about why anyone had done anything. She did not call Grandpa evil or Auntie a liar. She only described what she remembered. Grandpa put Mom's bag outside. Auntie shut the door when I tried to get back in. Then she asked for juice. That simplicity landed harder than accusation. That night, after Ren was asleep, I lay alone listening to the monitor beside my bed. There was no snow hitting the window. No shouting. No one asking for Gavin's watch. Only the mechanical chirp of my own heart being counted. For the first time since the turnout, I let myself examine the part of the afternoon I did not like. I could have waited. When the watch appeared, I could have looked at Mallory's face, noticed Mom's mistake, registered Dad's reaction, and said nothing else until we were home. Ren had been in the car. The weather had been getting worse. I had been medically fragile. I had known those things. I had kept pushing. That choice did not make Dad put my bag in the snow. It did not make Mallory close the door. It did not make them drive away. But I had made a choice too. I sat with that without trying to rescue myself from it. Gavin had once accused me of treating every family crisis like something that had to be solved immediately. Back then I had hated the way he said it. In the hospital that night, I understood only one small piece of what he might have meant. Not enough to understand the watch. Not yet. The next morning, an investigator told me there had been another 911 call connected to the incident. It was Mom. She had called more than 20 minutes after my first connection. By then, the SUV had already traveled away from the turnout. Her first description had not been that they left a recently discharged cardiac patient and a 7-year-old outside in worsening weather. She had said there had been a family disagreement, that I had gotten out, and that they had lost contact with me afterward. Lost contact. I looked at that phrase for a long time after the investigator repeated it. You lost contact with someone whose location you did not know. You did not lose contact with a woman you had watched standing beside her child in the snow. I did not know yet whether Mom had chosen those words, because Dad told her to, because she was afraid, or because saying what they had actually done would force her to hear it herself. I only knew that before the cold had even left Ren's body, my family had begun sanding the sharp edges off what happened. By afternoon, Ren's condition had improved enough that the tension in every adult who entered her room softened. She would recover. No permanent injury was expected. She still tired quickly and wanted Bishop close, but the dangerous part had passed. Mine had too, at least for the moment. I was still in bed when Marcus arrived. I had not seen him in nearly 8 months. Gavin's older brother had turned 45 that year, and grief had aged him differently than it had me. I had become harder around emergencies. Marcus had become quieter around people. He was taller than Gavin had been, narrower through the shoulders, with the same habit of pressing his lips together before saying something he knew would be unpleasant. He did not arrive with flowers. He did not hug me. He looked first through the open doorway toward Wren's room, where she was safe. Then he looked at me. I reached into the small belongings bag beside the bed and took out Gavin's watch. Marcus did not touch it immediately. His entire face changed anyway. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. And something older. I placed it on the blanket between us. I told him Wren had found it after Mallory dropped it near my hospital bed. Marcus sat down. For a long moment, his hands remained folded between his knees. 4 years earlier, not long after Gavin's funeral, Marcus had tried to talk to me about the route his brother had taken the night he died. He had said something about the timing not making sense. He had wanted to know why Gavin had been so far up the pass that late in deteriorating weather. I had stopped him, not gently. I had told him I could not survive turning Gavin's death into a puzzle. I had asked him never to raise it again. He had listened. And then, eventually, he had stopped coming around as often. Sitting across from him now, I could have reached for all the reasons I had done it. Wren had been 3. I had barely been sleeping. There were days after Gavin died when making toast felt like a technical problem beyond me. All of that was true. None of it changed what I had done to Marcus. "You tried to tell me something," I said. His eyes stayed on the watch. "Yes." I waited. The old version of me would have explained myself before he could continue. I would have told him how broken I had been, how afraid I was of conspiracy, how badly I needed Gavin's death to remain one terrible accident instead of a door leading into more questions. I did not. Marcus finally picked up the watch and turned it over in his palm. Gavin's brother knew the extra hole in the strap, too. He ran a thumb over it once. Then he set the watch back down. He told me Gavin had been calling him more often in the months before the crash. Not about work. Not about me in the way I first feared. About Mallory. About rides she needed at inconvenient hours. Car problems that became emergencies. Situations where she called because whoever she had contacted first had told her no. Gavin had started noticing a pattern long before I had. Marcus did not give me the rest. Not yet. His face made it clear that whatever he knew was attached to something between us that had never healed. I looked down at Gavin's watch sitting on the hospital blanket. 4 years ago, I had asked Marcus to stop asking questions because I believed unanswered grief was safer than answers I could not survive. Now my daughter had nearly frozen because my family had been willing to drive away rather than let me ask one. Marcus leaned back in the chair. "If Mallory had his watch," he said, "then you finally have to hear what you wouldn't hear from me 4 years ago." Marcus did not explain everything that afternoon. That was the first thing about him I had forgotten. He was not a man who filled silence because silence made other people uncomfortable. Gavin had been the same way when something mattered. They would let a question sit until you were ready to hear the answer, instead of rushing in to rescue you from it. 4 years earlier, I had mistaken that patience for accusation. Sitting in my hospital room with Gavin's watch between us, I realized Marcus was waiting to see whether I would do the same thing again. I did not ask him to soften whatever came next. I did not tell him I had nearly died, that Wren had nearly frozen, that there were limits to how much one person could carry in a week. There were. But Marcus had carried something too. Eventually, he told me that what he knew would make more sense when I was home, when Wren was safe, and when we were not trying to untangle 4 years of history beside a cardiac monitor. He promised nothing beyond that. I accepted it. That alone felt different. A few days later, I came home for the second time. The first discharge had ended at Pine Ridge Turnout. The second ended, with Nadine standing in my kitchen, like she had staged a quiet occupation while I was gone. My refrigerator had been stocked. The laundry basket that had been overflowing before I collapsed had vanished. Bishop's food container was full. Wren's school had been contacted, assignments collected, and a small mountain of unopened mail had been moved from the counter into one neat stack, without anybody making decisions on my behalf. I stood inside the doorway looking at all of it and immediately started calculating what I owed her. Nadine saw my face before I said anything. "You have one job." I waited. "Remain vertical." That earned a small laugh from me. It also ended the argument. Months earlier, I would have found 3 ways to repay her before sunset. I would have transferred money for groceries, insisted on taking her to dinner, offered to fix something in her house, or stored the favor away like a debt that had to be cleared before it acquired emotional interest. That afternoon, I managed 2 words. "Thank you." They felt strangely exposed. Nadine nodded as though I had done something difficult and not simply behaved like a normal person receiving kindness. Wren came in behind me with Bishop close to her side. The hospital had cleared her medically. Her temperature had normalized. Her blood work and cardiac monitoring had been reassuring, and the doctors expected no lasting physical damage from the hypothermia. On paper, she was fine. Children did not live on paper. The first thing she did after entering the house was check the front window. Then she asked where my phone was. I showed her. She nodded, carried her backpack into the kitchen, and began taking things out. A half-full package of crackers, 2 small water bottles, a knit cap, a flashlight from the junk drawer that I had not noticed was missing. I watched her place them together beside the back door. "What's that for?" She kept arranging the crackers. "In case." I waited. She pressed one bottle closer to the other. "Cars can leave." There was no accusation in it, no lesson, just a fact my daughter had learned. Something shifted in my chest that had nothing to do with myocarditis. I wanted to tell her that what happened would never happen again. I wanted to explain that Grandpa and Aunt Mallory had made a terrible choice, that most adults did not leave children beside mountain roads, that she did not need emergency supplies 3 feet from our kitchen. I wanted to fix the fear with information. Instead, I sat down at the table because standing had begun to make my legs tremble. "That scared you." Wren shrugged. Her shoulders were too high. I waited. A few seconds later, she nodded. That was all. I did not tell her what her fear meant. I did not use her little emergency pile to explain my childhood to myself. She was 7. She had almost frozen. For the moment, that was enough truth. I asked whether she wanted the supplies to stay there. She said yes. So they stayed. Bishop lay beside them as though he had been assigned guard duty over 2 bottles of water and a sleeve of crackers. Marcus came by that evening. He brought no folder, no old documents, no box of Gavin's belongings, just himself, and a paper bag containing soup from a place Gavin used to claim was the only restaurant in Colorado that understood black pepper. Wren ate half a grilled cheese at the table while Marcus and I waited until she wandered into the living room with Bishop. I had spent the hours before his arrival trying not to guess. That was harder than I expected. The watch had been in Mallory's possession. Gavin had apparently complained to Marcus about her before he died. My parents had recognized the watch in the car. 4 years of grief made the mind dangerous when handed 3 pieces of information and an empty space between them. There was one possibility I hated enough that I could not avoid thinking about it. Gavin and Mallory. I never said the word affair aloud. Marcus must have seen where my face went anyway. His expression hardened not at me, exactly, but at the thought. He told me that if I was imagining Gavin secretly meeting Mallory for reasons that belonged in somebody else's marriage, I was chasing the wrong thing. What Marcus remembered was frustration, not tenderness, not secrecy for pleasure. Exhaustion. That distinction did not comfort me as much as it should have. There are many ways for a marriage to contain something hidden. Not all of them involve desire. Marcus began with the months before Gavin died. There had been phone calls I never knew about. Nothing dramatic when separated from the pattern. The calls sounded ordinary when separated from the pattern. A ride after an argument, a car that would not start, a lockout, a warning light. Mallory was convinced meant the engine was dying. Once, she called Gavin because she had driven farther than she intended after a fight and did not feel safe driving home upset. Gavin knew cars. He had worked municipal fleet maintenance for years, and people had always called him when something made a noise, flashed a warning light, or refused to start. He could listen to an engine for 10 seconds and make you feel foolish for having considered a funeral for it. At first, helping Mallory probably felt ordinary. She was my sister. Gavin was her brother-in-law. That was how family worked. Until help became expectation. Marcus said the calls changed gradually. Mallory started contacting Gavin after someone else had already told her no. Sometimes after Dad refused to drive across town. Sometimes after I was unavailable. Sometimes because she knew Gavin was less likely to lecture her before fixing whatever had gone wrong. He had mentioned it to Marcus more than once. I searched backward through my own memory and found almost nothing. That hurt more than finding a lie. I remembered Mallory thanking Gavin for looking at her brakes once. I remembered him changing a battery for her in our driveway. I remembered her calling during dinner and Gavin stepping into the garage with his phone because Wren was throwing peas at the dog. Ordinary pieces. Nothing I had considered worth storing. Marcus explained that Gavin had not originally hidden the calls because he thought he was doing anything wrong. If anything, he thought he was preventing Mallory's problems from becoming mine. That was the part that sat badly. Gavin had been absorbing the emergencies because he knew exactly what I would do if they reached me. I would fix them. The memory came with no warning. Gavin was standing at our kitchen sink, sleeves pushed above his elbows, washing grease from his hands. Wren had been 3 and asleep upstairs. I was sorting daycare forms at the table. He had just gotten back from helping Mallory with something involving her car. I could no longer remember what. He had dried his hands on a dish towel and said something I had dismissed so completely at the time that remembering it now felt like discovering a bruise beneath old clothing. Every problem in your family eventually becomes our emergency. I had not shouted. Neither had he. That somehow made it worse. I had told him Mallory was having a hard time and that he was being unfair. I reminded him that she had always been more anxious than I was. I said families helped each other. Gavin had looked at me for several seconds. Then he had folded the towel once and put it on the counter. He stopped arguing. At the time, I thought I had won. Sitting across from Marcus 4 years later, I could see what I had actually accomplished. I had taught my husband that bringing the problem to me would only require him to defend why it was a problem. So he had begun handling it without me. I let the silence stay. Marcus did too. From the living room came the faint sound of an animated movie and Bishop's collar shifting when he moved. Wren laughed once at something on the screen. That sound nearly broke me. Gavin had not been perfect. Neither had I. Marriage had not protected us from getting tired of each other's families or from choosing the wrong argument to win. The dead were often polished by the people left behind until they became impossible versions of themselves. Gavin had not been a saint. He forgot appointments unless they were written on the refrigerator. He left work boots exactly where I could trip over them. He could turn a 10-minute repair into a 3-hour project because the moment one bolt looked worn, he decided civilization depended on replacing it. And when he believed somebody was using me, he could become stubborn enough to make me want to throw something. None of that made him less loved. It made what I had dismissed more real. Marcus picked up Gavin's watch from the table. I had brought it downstairs because keeping it hidden in my bedroom felt ridiculous now. He turned the strap over and rubbed the extra hole Gavin had punched years earlier. Then he mentioned something I had not considered. Gavin almost never took the watch off unless he was working with tools or putting his hands somewhere metal could catch the band. Marcus knew that, because Gavin had once spent 20 minutes lecturing him about why people should remove watches before reaching into engine compartments. I stared at the darkened leather. The watch did not tell me where Gavin had been. It did not tell me what Mallory had said. But if he had left it somewhere connected to her, there was a good chance he had been doing what everyone expected Gavin to do: fixing something. The question that came next was obvious enough that Marcus asked it before I could. Marcus asked the obvious question. What about Gavin's phone? The crash had damaged it badly, and because his death had been treated as an accident, nobody had sought carrier records or performed a criminal-style extraction of his final contacts. I had received the ruined device with his other belongings and eventually put it away with things I could neither use nor throw out. There was no digital trail waiting 4 years later to solve the night for us. Whatever we learned would have to come from people who were still alive and what they could reliably remember. Marcus leaned back and looked toward the living room. For the first time that evening, the tightness around his mouth eased. He said Gavin had once called him after helping Mallory with another minor catastrophe and announced that he had made a serious administrative error in his marriage. I braced for something painful. Instead, Marcus gave me the line Gavin had apparently used. I married one Calloway and somehow got the family subscription. The laugh came out before I could stop it. Not polite laughter, real laughter. It caught in the middle and turned painful enough that I pressed a hand against my ribs. Marcus smiled for about 2 seconds. Then neither of us did. That was grief in its most honest form. You could be laughing because someone had been funny and hurting because there would never be another new joke. For 4 years, too many of my memories of Gavin had ended with snow, twisted metal, and hospital corridors. For a few seconds, he was back in the world as a man who made bad jokes about my family. I needed that more than I knew. My phone buzzed against the table. Dad. I did not open the message immediately. When I finally did, it was exactly the kind of message Frank Calloway wrote when he wanted control, without sounding controlling. He said I was turning Gavin's death into something sinister because I was furious about what happened at the turnout. He repeated that nobody had intended to endanger Wren. He said digging through an old tragedy while I was physically recovering was not healthy. There were several versions of Dad hidden inside those sentences. The father who worried about my heart, the man terrified of losing his granddaughter, and the man who desperately wanted me to stop asking why Mallory had Gavin's watch. I did not reply. Marcus noticed me put the phone face down. He did not ask what Dad had said. That, too, was different from my family. Marcus did not seem to believe every silence required intervention. I told him I did not want to chase theories. The past few days had shown me how quickly a few facts could turn into a story if people needed them to. Dad already had his version of the turnout. Mallory had hers. I did not want to build my own version of Gavin's death, simply because I hated theirs. So I made a decision. I would reconstruct the last 48 hours of Gavin's life as far as ordinary memory allowed. Where he had gone, who expected him, what he told me, what he told Marcus. Not because I thought I could prosecute someone or transform an accident into something else. I wanted to know where my husband had been. That should not have felt like too much to ask. Once I decided to start with sequence instead of suspicion, another memory surfaced. The night Gavin died, Wren had been 3. She had gone through a phase where bedtime involved 2 glasses of water, one missing stuffed rabbit, and a solemn argument about why socks were oppressive. I had been upstairs with her when Gavin received a call. By the time I came downstairs, he had his coat on. I asked where he was going. He said there was a vehicle problem up the pass. Those were the words. A vehicle problem. I had assumed it was someone from work, or an acquaintance who knew Gavin could fix almost anything with wheels. I had not asked whose vehicle. That part was mine, not Mallory's. Not Dad's. Mine. At the time, I had been relieved it was Gavin going instead of me. Wren was finally settling down. I had been tired. He was better with cars anyway. I remembered telling him to be careful. I remembered him checking the weather on his phone before leaving. I remembered the sound of the garage door. There was no foreboding music in real life, no instinct warning me to stop him. I had gone upstairs and found Wren asleep sideways across her bed. Gavin never came home. Marcus had gone very still. I asked what he remembered. He looked at the watch again, then told me that Gavin had called him later that night. The signal had been poor. Their conversation had not lasted long. Marcus remembered road noise, wind, Gavin sounding angrier than frightened. At first, Gavin complained generally enough that Marcus did not understand what had happened. Then he said Mallory's name. My hands stopped moving. Marcus did not rush through the rest. Gavin told him that Mallory had lied to him again. Marcus had asked what she lied about. The connection had broken before Gavin gave him a useful answer. When he called again, Gavin answered briefly, said he was on his way back and did not want to talk while driving in worsening conditions. Marcus remembered one sentence because of how final Gavin sounded. Mallory lied to me again. I'm done. Nothing in those words told me what the lie had been. They did not tell me why Gavin had gone. They did not tell me how the watch ended up with her. But they erased one possibility forever. Mallory had not merely found Gavin's watch somewhere after he died. Gavin had been dealing with Mallory that night. Marcus looked at me for a long time before continuing. He told me he would help me remember what he could. He would answer questions. He would help separate things Gavin had actually said from things grief might have rearranged over 4 years. But he wanted one condition. If we did this, I had to be willing to hear things that made Mallory look bad, things that made Mom and Dad look bad, and things that made me look bad. He did not soften that last part. 4 years earlier, I would have. I would have reminded him that I had been Gavin's wife, that I had known him best, that grief had nearly swallowed me whole. This time, I looked toward the living room. Wren was sitting on the carpet with Bishop beside her. The little emergency bag she had made earlier was still visible by the door. Cars can leave. My daughter had learned something about safety because adults had chosen comfort over truth. I did not want another version of that lesson. I'll listen, Marcus nodded once. That was all the agreement required. After he left, I stood in the kitchen with one hand braced against the counter and Gavin's watch in the other. For 4 years, I had believed my husband died after answering some anonymous vehicle problem somewhere west of home. A bad road, bad weather, bad luck. That story had been painful enough that I never looked beneath it. Now there was one fact I could no longer put back where it had been. Gavin had not died coming home from some nameless roadside job. He had been coming back from Mallory. For the next 2 days, I did not call Mallory. That surprised even me. There had been a time when knowing Gavin had been with her on the night he died would have sent me straight to her door. I would have demanded an explanation before I had enough information to know which questions mattered. I would have pushed until somebody broke, then mistaken the breaking for truth. The woman I had been before the hospital might have done that. The woman I had been before Pine Ridge turnout almost certainly would have. But Wren still checked the front window every time a car slowed outside our house. That changed the order of things. Before I tried to understand Gavin's final night, I needed to make sure my daughter understood that one terrible afternoon had not rewritten every rule of the world. She started therapy the following week. Dr. Priya Shah did not begin by asking Wren to describe the snowstorm in detail. She did not ask what Grandpa had said, why Aunt Mallory shut the door, or whether Wren thought anyone meant to hurt her. She let Wren choose where to sit. She let Bishop stay near the doorway for the first session. She asked about school, drawing, the stuffed horse Wren had brought, and why her coat was still zipped despite the warm room. Wren said she liked being ready. Dr. Shah did not challenge that. Later, after Wren had spent 10 minutes drawing a dog with 6 legs because she said 4 did not look fast enough, Dr. Shah asked what she thought people should be ready for. Wren kept coloring. Leaving. One word. Just leaving. I sat against the wall and kept my mouth shut. That was harder than it sounds. Every part of me wanted to translate. To tell Dr. Shaw that Wren meant the car, that she had started keeping water by the door, that she asked about weather before breakfast, that she no longer liked being the last child waiting at school pickup, even when I arrived early. I wanted to make the pattern useful by naming it. Instead, I watched my daughter draw 6 legs on a dog because 4 did not feel fast enough. Dr. Shaw asked Wren what helped when she worried somebody might leave. Wren looked at Bishop, then at me, then back at the page. That session belonged to her, not to my investigation. I learned that distinction slowly. Marcus helped me with the other thing. He remembered the name Leah Moreno because Gavin had mentioned her once in connection with Mallory's mountain trip. Leah and Mallory had been close then. Not best friends exactly, but close enough that Leah had helped arrange the rental Mallory used the weekend Gavin died. I had met her twice. A birthday dinner years earlier, a summer barbecue where Gavin had burned one side of the chicken and insisted the blackened layer was protective seasoning. Leah and Mallory had drifted apart sometime after Gavin's death. I did not know why. Marcus had an old number. I stared at it for almost half an hour before calling. I was less worried that Leah would lie than that I would ask questions shaped by the answer I already wanted. Before calling, I limited myself to facts. Where Mallory had stayed, what happened to her car, whether she had shelter, and whether help was already on the way. I left Gavin, blame and theories out of it. Leah sounded startled to hear from me, but she did not resist once she understood I was asking about that night. She remembered the rental because she had recommended it. A friend of a friend managed several small cabins near Divide, and Mallory had wanted somewhere away from Colorado Springs after a breakup that had turned the preceding month into one long emotional weather system. According to Leah, Mallory drove up despite a worsening forecast. Her car slid partly into a ditch on the private access road near the rental. That much had always been true. What came next was not what I expected. The rental was close enough that Mallory had already made it inside. The cabin had heat, power, and imperfect but usable cell service. Leah had spoken with her there, and a tow service had already been contacted. The wait would be long because weather calls were stacking up, but someone was coming. The wait was going to be long because weather calls were stacking up, but someone was coming. Leah had told Mallory to stay overnight. She remembered being irritated because Mallory kept insisting she needed the car out immediately. That was all Leah knew. She did not know Gavin was driving up. She had never spoken to him that night. She did not know what Mallory told him. When I asked whether Mallory had sounded frightened, Leah hesitated before saying yes, but Mallory often sounded frightened when she felt out of control. That answer did not prove anything. It mattered anyway. I thanked her and ended the call before I could ask questions. She could not answer. For several minutes afterward, I sat at my kitchen table looking at the little stack Wren had left beside the door. Water, crackers, flashlight. The difference between fear and danger had started to matter to me in a way it never had before. Mallory might have been afraid that night. I believed that, but fear did not tell me what danger existed. And Gavin had apparently driven into worsening weather for something Leah described as a vehicle stuck near a heated rental with a tow already requested. The pieces still did not tell me what Mallory had said to him. They only made one thing harder to explain. Why had Gavin believed he needed to go? My mother called the next morning. Not Dad. Diane. She had called several times since the storm, but I had allowed almost all of them to go to voicemail. Her messages changed tone depending on the day. Sometimes she sounded frightened for Wren. Sometimes ashamed. Sometimes she repeated that she had told Dad to turn around, as though the sentence might eventually become heavy enough to balance what had happened. This time, she left no message. 5 minutes later, a text appeared. She asked to see me alone. She wanted to meet away from both our houses, without Frank or Mallory. I read the text twice. Then I checked the front room. Wren was on the floor beside Bishop, building a veterinary clinic out of cardboard boxes. Bishop had been assigned the role of patient and looked deeply resigned to his diagnosis. I did not bring her to meet my mother. That was not punishment. It was not leverage. Ren was not a reward adults earned by confessing enough. Nadine stayed with her while I met Mom at a quiet cafe, halfway between our houses. I arrived first because being late still made my skin itch. The cardiologist had cleared me for short drives by then, but I still moved carefully. My stamina returned in pieces. 10 minutes behind the wheel could make me feel more tired than an hour used to. Mom came in wearing the same gray coat she had worn to the hospital the day I was discharged. I noticed because there was still a pale salt mark near the hem from that afternoon. For a few seconds, neither of us touched the coffee in front of us. She looked older. That observation annoyed me. Guilt had a way of making the people who hurt you look fragile, and fragility could become another demand if you were not careful. Mom began by saying she should have told me years ago. I said nothing. She had probably prepared for anger. Silence seemed harder for her. She started with the version that made the most sense. The first days after Gavin died, she and Dad believed telling me anything about Mallory would destroy what was left of me. I could remember those days. Barely. Ren had been 3. She kept asking why Daddy's truck was still at work when Gavin never drove a truck. She confused death with travel because adults kept saying he was gone. I slept in bursts. Food tasted like paper. I once stood in a grocery store holding a carton of milk until an employee asked if I needed help because I could not remember whether Gavin had liked whole or 2%. The answer was 2. I remembered that after I got home. So when Mom said they thought I could not handle more truth during those first days, I understood. That did not mean I agreed, but I understood. If you'd waited a week, I said, maybe I could understand that. Mom lowered her eyes. A week was not what happened. She admitted that too. At first Dad said there would be time after the funeral, then after the paperwork, then after Ren settled back into preschool. There was always a reason tomorrow would be kinder. By the time months had passed, silence was no longer temporary. Life was simply easier for everyone who did not have to name Mallory's connection to Gavin's final night. Mom said that without looking at me. Easier. For whom, I almost asked. But I knew, so I waited. She finally told me Gavin had gone to Mallory that night. The words should not have shocked me after Marcus. They did anyway. There is a difference between suspecting a truth and hearing your mother admit she helped keep it from you for 4 years. Mom said Mallory called them after Gavin's crash. By the time my parents reached her, the family had been notified that Gavin was dead, and Mallory already knew. Mom's hands tightened around the paper cup. I watched the cardboard sleeve crease beneath her fingers. She had his watch. The noise of the cafe seemed to flatten. Not disappear, just lose depth. A grinder ran behind the counter. Someone laughed near the window. A chair scraped tile. All of it felt far away. Mom said Mallory was holding Gavin's field watch when they saw her. Mallory told them he had taken it off earlier and forgotten it. Dad understood immediately what it meant. If they returned the watch to me, I would ask where Gavin had left it. Then I would ask why he had been with Mallory. Then the whole final evening would have to be explained. Dad told Mallory to put it away. Mom let him. I stared at the coffee between us. 4 years. Christmases. Birthdays. Ren learning to read. Mom sitting in my kitchen on the anniversary of Gavin's death and telling me grief did not have a schedule. Dad helping me replace a broken fence panel Gavin would have fixed in 20 minutes. Mallory bringing Ren a birthday cake with too many candles because she thought it was funny. The watch had existed through all of that. Somewhere in Mallory's possession. My mother had known. I had imagined confession would produce anger clean enough to use. Instead, I felt tired. Not hospital tired. Older than that. You saw me look for it. Mom's mouth tightened. She remembered. After Gavin died, I had asked once whether anyone had found his watch. Mom had been standing beside me. She had known the answer. She said nothing. My fingers moved toward the edge of the table, then stopped. I did not need to tell her how bad that was. Her face already knew. What I needed were facts. I asked why Mallory had brought the watch to my hospital room now. That was a question no one had answered. For the first time since we sat down, Mom looked directly at me. She said Mallory had told her about it 2 days before I was discharged. When the doctors warned the family I might not survive the weekend, Mallory panicked. Not only about losing me, about the possibility I would die without Gavin's watch ever being returned. Mallory told Mom that Ren deserved to have something of her father's one day. She had brought the watch to the hospital, intending to put it back among my belongings without explaining where it had been. Mallory had meant to return the watch quietly, without explaining where it had spent 4 years. Ren saw it fall before she could. Mom knew the plan, and, once again, had advised silence while I recovered. Mallory wanted to repair the result without surviving the truth required to repair it. "I can understand why you didn't tell me the day Gavin died," I said. Mom's face lifted slightly. I did not let that become relief. "I cannot understand 4 years. Her eyes lowered again. That was as much defense as I allowed her. I could understand a delay measured in days. 4 years was no longer compassion or fear alone. It was a choice. I moved to the other question. The storm. Mom's body changed before I finished. Her hands opened. One rubbed the other wrist. I asked why she had let Dad drive away with Ren standing outside. She said she had not thought they were truly leaving at first. Dad had been angry. Mallory was panicking about the watch. Mom thought he intended to drive a short distance, let everyone cool down, then circle back. That explanation did not make the first movement of the SUV harmless. It told me how she had excused it. Mom admitted she had told Dad not to leave Ren. I already remembered that. What I wanted to know was what happened after the car started moving. She said she froze. The word irritated me enough that I almost stood up. Then my body reminded me I still could not do dramatic exits without paying for them. I stayed seated. Mom described looking through the rear window and seeing Ren beside me, Bishop against my leg, snow crossing the road. She said the distance opened, before the seriousness did. By the time she began telling Dad to turn around, he was already back on the highway. Mallory argued that they should give me a few minutes. Dad said I had survived worse. Mom, let that sentence sit between us. So did I. Dad's old compliment had become permission. Aaron had survived worse, so Aaron could survive this too. She said they drove farther than she wanted. She said she eventually insisted they call for help when road conditions worsened, and Dad still did not turn back immediately. I knew from the investigation that Mom's call came more than 20 minutes after mine. I also knew how she described it. Family disagreement. I got out. Lost contact. Mom admitted she had minimized what happened because saying, "We left them there," felt too terrible. There was no point in yelling at her. The sentence condemned itself. She had been more afraid of describing the act accurately than of the act becoming more dangerous, while she searched for gentler language. That mattered. I asked one final question. Why had Dad reacted to Marcus's name in the car? Mom looked past me toward the cafe window. Snowmelt ran in narrow streaks down the glass. She seemed to decide something. Then she told me there was another part of Gavin's night I did not know. Dad had known Mallory was not in the kind of danger she apparently described to Gavin. Not after the fact in a vague way. He knew enough, before Gavin was buried, to understand that whatever brought Gavin up the mountain had not matched the reality at the rental. I thought of Leah. "Heated cabin," Tao requested. Mallory safely inside. I kept my voice low. "How?" Mom shook her head. "Not refusing forever." Not yet able to say it. She told me Dad knew because Mallory admitted enough after Gavin died for him to understand she had not been as stranded as Gavin believed. That was all she would give me. For the first time during the conversation, anger moved cleanly through me. Not because Mom was crying. She was. not because Dad had hidden something else. I was beginning to expect that, because even now, 4 years later, after Ren had nearly frozen and I had nearly landed back in intensive care, my mother was still measuring truth by how much discomfort the people who caused the harm could survive. I stood slowly. Mom reached toward me. I moved my hand before she could touch it. There was no speech, no declaration that she was dead to me, no promise that she would never see Ren again. I did not know what our relationship would become. Pretending I did would have been another way of choosing certainty over truth. I told her I needed facts more than an apology. Then I left. Outside, the air was cold but still. Nothing like Pine Ridge. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel. Sitting in the car afterward, I could admit that my parents' fear during the first days of my grief had not been invented. What I could not accept was turning that fear into 4 years of control over a truth that belonged to me. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Marcus had sent a message, asking how the meeting went. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked through the windshield at people crossing the parking lot with shopping bags and coffee, ordinary lives moving through an ordinary afternoon. Gavin had driven up the mountain because of Mallory. Mallory had possessed his watch afterward. My parents had seen it. Dad had ordered it hidden. Mom had allowed 4 years to pass. And now I knew something else. Whatever Mallory told Gavin that night, my father had learned enough after Gavin died to know it was not true. I finally texted Marcus 3 words. Dad knew too. Then I drove home. That evening, Ren was asleep on the couch, with her feet tucked beneath Bishop's chest. Nadine had left a pot of soup on the stove, and a note ordering me not to return the container until I had eaten everything inside it. I almost smiled. My life was filling with people who helped without demanding that I disappear inside the help. I stood there longer than necessary, watching Ren sleep. Then my mother's last admission returned. Not the watch, not the 4 years. The part she had struggled hardest to say. Your father knew she lied to Gavin. He knew before we buried him. The sentence my mother left me with did not feel like new information, so much as a key turning inside an old lock. Dad knew Mallory had lied to Gavin. He knew before we buried him. For the next several days, I carried that knowledge without doing anything dramatic with it. I did not drive to my parents' house. I did not call Mallory. I did not sit at the kitchen table constructing a speech I imagined delivering when everyone was finally forced to listen. Instead, I began noticing things. Not clues, patterns. They were harder to dismiss because most of them had never been secret. Mallory had been 8. The first time I could remember our parents interrupting an entire evening because she was afraid she had failed a spelling test. She had not failed it. She had gotten 3 words wrong and decided before the papers were even graded that her teacher would move her down a reading group, her friends would laugh at her, and she would probably have to repeat the year. Mom sat beside her on the kitchen floor until she stopped crying. Dad drove back to school because Mallory believed she had left the worksheet in her desk and could not sleep without checking it. I was 12. I had a fever that night. I remember standing in the doorway with a blanket around my shoulders while Mom told me to take some medicine and go back to bed because I was the sensible one. Nothing terrible happened. That was what made memories like that easy to excuse. Mallory calmed down. Dad came home. My fever broke. The family moved on. Years later, when Mallory panicked before her first college presentation, Dad drove 2 hours to bring her a blazer she had decided she could not present without. When I called Mom from basic training after a week that had reduced my hands to blisters and my confidence to something I barely recognized, she reminded me I had always been the strong one. I had been proud of being the capable one. Competence brought trust, praise, and the quiet status of being the daughter nobody had to worry about. Mallory was rescued. I was admired. We both learned our roles, and because I liked mine more than I admitted, I helped keep the system running. That admission was uglier than blaming my parents. By adulthood, I had my own history of reinforcing it. Late night pickups, practical fixes, hours spent repairing consequences. Mallory could have handled herself. I called it sisterhood. And sometimes it was. The problem was that none of us knew where ordinary family help ended, and responsibility quietly changed hands. I thought about Gavin. Not the night he died. A different night. Wren had been too. She had an ear infection, and had finally fallen asleep against my chest after hours of crying. Gavin had worked an early shift that day, and was exhausted enough that he had fallen asleep sitting upright on the couch. Mallory called because her car would not start outside a restaurant. She had already called Dad. He had told her to use roadside assistance because it was after 10 and snow had started falling. Mallory called me next. I could not leave Wren, so I woke Gavin. He sat there for a second with sleep still on his face while I explained. Then he put on his boots. He drove across town. He jumped Mallory's battery. He came home after midnight and went to work before sunrise. The next morning I kissed him in the kitchen and thanked him for helping my sister. I never asked whether he wanted to be the person who went. That memory stayed with me longer than I expected. It would have been easy to say Gavin could have refused. He could have. So could I. That was not the point. Marriage was full of things people technically had the right to refuse, but did anyway, because someone they loved had placed the burden in their hands. I had placed plenty in Gavin's. Then I had become angry when he tried to tell me the weight was getting too heavy. Mallory contacted me on the 4th day, after my meeting with Mom, not by calling, a message. Long enough that I could tell she had written it, edited it, probably rewritten it, and still believed the final version would make sense to me. She started with the storm. She said she was sorry Wren had been hurt. Not that they had hurt her. That Wren had been hurt. The passive construction irritated me enough that I almost stopped reading. Then Mallory did something I did not expect. She accused me of pretending our family had created her alone. She reminded me of the times I had come when she called, the apartments I had driven to after bad relationships, the nights I told her everything would be okay before I had any basis to promise it, the times I stepped between her and Dad when he wanted her to deal with consequences I considered too harsh. One sentence stopped me. "You were the first person who taught me you would always come." I read the line twice because I wanted to reject it and could not. Before Gavin became the backup rescuer, before Dad settled fully into the role of fixer, there had been me, the older sister, who answered. Mallory was right about that part. I had repeatedly shown her that enough fear would bring me to the door, and I had expected her to learn boundaries. I rarely made her practice. I set the phone down. The house was quiet except for Bishop shifting in the hallway. For several minutes, I let Mallory's sentence remain true without correcting it. That was difficult. Then I picked up the phone and kept reading. The truth lasted 3 more paragraphs. After that, Mallory crossed the line she had crossed her entire life. She wrote that Gavin was an adult. He chose to drive. Nobody forced him. If he went into bad weather, that was his decision. She said everyone was turning an accident into something she had done because guilt made people need someone to blame. Then she reached the present. According to Mallory, I had done the same thing at Pine Ridge. I had chosen an old watch over keeping my daughter safe. That line sat differently than I wanted it to. Her accusation about Pine Ridge landed differently. I had already admitted to myself that I should have postponed the questions once the weather and the car became unsafe. Wren was beside me. My heart had barely stabilized, and the watch could have waited. I had made that tactical mistake. But the mistake ended there. I had asked them to take Wren back into the car. I had not chosen for Mallory to shut the door, or for Dad to drive away. Mallory's message forced me to hold both truths without using either one to erase the other. I did not answer her. Not because I had nothing to say, because I did not yet trust myself to separate what belonged to me from what she was trying to hand back. The investigation into the storm continued, without requiring me to turn my life into a police drama. Most of it happened away from me. The storm investigation kept moving mostly without me. The case was cumulative, 911 timing, Wren's medical record, weather conditions, Mom's partial account, and the adults' own statements. The one genuinely new admission came from Dad. He said he meant to leave us there for about 5 minutes so everyone could calm down, while still insisting he intended to return. The harder consequence arrived at home. Wren came back from school one afternoon quieter than usual. She ate half her dinner, gave the rest of her chicken to Bishop when she thought I was not looking, then disappeared into her room before finishing homework. I found her curled on the bed with both knees pulled toward her stomach. Her face was pale. I asked how long her stomach had hurt. She told me since lunch. I sat down beside her. "Why didn't you tell your teacher?" Her fingers tightened around the blanket. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked at my chest. Not my face. My chest. "Your heart needs quiet." The room seemed to contract. There was no Mallory in that sentence. No Dad. No Mom. No Storm. That lesson belonged partly to me. Wren had spent weeks watching adults tell me not to get upset because of my heart. She had watched me hide fatigue. Before the hospital, she had watched me ignore illness until I collapsed. She knew what I had taught her. Problems hurt, Mom. Good girls do not make problems. I lay one hand on the blanket between us. I did not tell her she had misunderstood. Children often understand exactly what adults demonstrate, even when adults dislike the conclusion. I should have told people sooner when I was sick, too. Wren looked up. I let the sentence stand. I told her that hiding pain had not protected me. It had made it harder for people to help. Her stomach hurting was not noise my heart needed protection from. She did not need the family history. She did not need a lesson about generational roles. She needed permission to have a stomachache. That evening it turned out to be nothing serious. A combination of stress, too little lunch, and the kind of childhood stomach discomfort that disappeared after rest, fluids, and crackers. The cause mattered less than the hiding. After Wren fell asleep, I found myself making the kind of list that normally calmed me. Appointments, school pickup, groceries, medication, laundry, Bishop's food. That night it looked less like organization than evidence of how quickly I filled every open space with responsibility. I picked up my phone and called Nadine. I asked if she could handle school pickup 2 days later when I had cardiology. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she agreed. Nadine agreed to handle school pickup 2 days later when I had cardiology. I almost promised to repay her, stopped myself, and managed the same 2 difficult words I had used before. Thank you. Mom called the next morning from a number I recognized as belonging to her sister. She had left Dad's house temporarily. Not dramatically. No divorce papers. No declaration that 40 years of marriage were finished. She packed a bag and went to stay elsewhere because Dad wanted them to continue presenting one shared version of what happened at Pine Ridge, and Mom had decided she would no longer do that. She told investigators that she had not been honest enough in her first emergency call. She had also told Dad she would not repeat that Aaron simply chose to leave the car. I listened. Part of me wanted to reassure Mom the moment she corrected her account, as though one truthful act required me to make the fear easier for her. I recognized the reflex and left it alone. I told her only that correcting the account mattered. There was a pause. Then Mom said she had one more thing to tell me about Gavin. My grip tightened around the phone. For the previous week, I had been living with her admission that Dad knew Mallory had lied. Leah had already established that Mallory had shelter. Marcus had established that Gavin was angry. But none of us knew the shape of the lie. Mom still did not give me all of it. She said that after Gavin died, Mallory had been frantic and difficult to follow. She kept repeating that she had only wanted somebody to come, that she had not thought the weather would get that bad, that she had not expected Gavin to believe her enough to drive immediately. There was one detail Mom remembered because Dad had seized on it too. Gavin had apparently refused Mallory at first. That stopped me. All these years, somewhere in the part of the story I had never been allowed to hear, Gavin had said no. He had set the boundary. Mallory had crossed it. Mom said Mallory did not simply ask again. She changed what Gavin believed was happening. I looked toward Wren's flashlight, water and crackers by the door objects prepared by a child who now understood the difference between inconvenience and danger. What did she tell him? Mom went quiet. I could hear traffic faintly wherever she was. Then she said the only part she was ready to say. She made him think she might freeze. My hand tightened around the phone until my fingers hurt. I did not ask the next question twice. Mom said she would tell me the rest in person. After the call ended, I stayed at the kitchen counter. Bishop walked in, stopped beside my leg, and leaned his shoulder against me for a moment before continuing toward his water bowl. Outside, the day was bright and cold. Snow remained in shaded patches along the fence, harmless under blue sky. Gavin had been good at saying no when something made no sense. Marcus had told me that. I remembered it too. He had already told Mallory he would not go. Then she had said something. Something strong enough to turn a refusal into a drive into worsening winter weather. For the first time, I stopped asking why Gavin had gone. The better question was what Mallory had made him believe. What had Mallory said that night to make a man who had already told her no drive into worsening weather? My mother told me the rest 2 days later. She chose my aunt's guest room because she was still staying there and because, for once, she seemed to understand that asking me to sit inside the house, where Dad had spent 4 years protecting the lie, would be its own kind of cruelty. I left Wren with Nadine and told her only that Grandma and I needed to talk about something old. Wren did not ask for details. She was beginning to learn that adults could carry adult things without making her responsible for them. That mattered more than whatever truth waited for me across town. Mom looked smaller without Dad beside her, not weaker, just less arranged. For most of my life, my parents had operated like a two-person system. Dad made decisions. Mom softened their edges. He said what was going to happen. She explained why it was probably for the best. Even when they disagreed, they usually arrived in front of the rest of us with one version. Now Mom sat alone at a kitchen table that did not belong to her, twisting the paper sleeve around a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. I did not ask her to start at Gavin. I asked her to start at the first no. That was the part I could not stop thinking about. Gavin had refused Mallory. Then something changed. Mom said that after Gavin died, Mallory repeated the same pieces of the night so many times that some of them had stayed lodged in her memory, even after she spent years trying not to touch them. Mallory's car had slid partly off the private access road near the rental. That part was true. The vehicle sat at an angle in snow deep enough that she could not get it out herself. She had already reached the cabin. The heat worked. The lights were on. She had cell service if she stood near one side of the room. A tow had been called. The wait would be long. Mallory hated that. Not the cold, the waiting, the lack of control. She had called Gavin because he knew vehicles and because, in our family, calling someone had always felt more active than accepting that a situation would remain unpleasant for a while. Gavin told her no. He had checked the weather. He knew conditions were worsening. He told her she was warm, had shelter, and had professional help coming. The car could wait until morning if necessary. That should have been the end. Instead, Mallory called again. This time she changed the situation. She told Gavin the heater at the cabin was not working properly. She told him she could not stay there. She said she was back in the car because she thought it was safer than the rental. She said the car heater had begun cutting out too. And then she told him she was scared she might freeze before the tow arrived. Mom's voice dropped on that last part. I stared at the grain of the table beneath my hands. For a moment all I could hear was Wren from a few nights earlier, telling me my heart needed quiet. Mallory had not invented every part of the night. She really was stuck, cold, delayed, and alone. The lie was the part that changed Gavin's decision. She had shelter and heat, yet made him believe she did not. I asked whether Mom knew why Mallory had done it. She said Mallory had tried to explain that part too. Mom said the breakup had left Mallory raw and embarrassed about getting stuck after people warned her not to drive up. She did not want to spend the night alone with a mess she could not immediately fix. She wanted someone familiar to arrive and take control. Mallory had not wanted Gavin dead. She had wanted Gavin present. I sat with that before asking what happened when he arrived. Some of it Mom knew from what Mallory admitted. Some she knew because Mallory had described it over and over in those first hours after the crash. Mom was careful when she reached the edges of what she had actually been told, and I was grateful for that. I did not need another person filling gaps to make a cleaner story. Gavin reached the rental and found Mallory inside. Warm, dry, not injured. The cabin heater was functioning. The tow had not abandoned her. Nothing about the situation matched the emergency she had described strongly enough to make him leave home and drive into worsening weather. Mom said Mallory remembered his face before he said anything. That detail hurt. I knew Gavin's silence. He was rarely most angry when he was loud. He was most angry when he became precise. He still went outside with her. That was the kind of man he was. Once there, he helped, because the problem existed in front of him, even if the reason he had been summoned was false. The car was not going to be driven out safely that night, but he checked the position, made sure it was stable, helped clear enough snow to prevent more sliding, and carried several of Mallory's things from the vehicle to the cabin. At some point during that work, he removed his watch. I pictured it without wanting to. The leather strap, the scratched crystal, Gavin pushing his sleeve back, taking the watch off because he hated catching metal on engine parts and tools, setting it somewhere close before stepping back into the snow. Mallory said he left it on a narrow shelf near the entry or windowsill after coming back inside. Neither of them noticed when he left. For 4 years, the watch had felt like an object with a secret trapped inside it. Now it became painfully ordinary. Gavin had simply taken it off to work. The thing had never contained the truth. It had only survived it. Once Gavin understood the extent of the lie, he told Mallory he was finished being summoned whenever someone else said no. He was done helping hide how often those emergencies landed on our marriage, and he intended to tell me the next morning. That detail made my stomach tighten, not because I feared what he had planned to reveal about Mallory, because I knew exactly how I might have responded. I had already defended her before. I had already made Gavin feel cruel for asking where help should end. If he had come home that night and told me Mallory had exaggerated danger to pull him into bad weather, would I have listened? I wanted the answer to be yes. I could not trust it. The last time he had tried to explain that our family's emergencies were taking over pieces of our marriage, I had told him Mallory was struggling. I had made his boundary sound like lack of compassion. After that, he stopped bringing every incident to me. That silence had not come from nowhere. I had helped build it. Mom stopped talking when she saw my hands tighten. I loosened them. There was nothing useful in injuring myself over a truth 4 years late. I asked what Mallory did. When Gavin said he would tell me, she cried. She apologized. Then she tried to explain why it should not matter now that he was already there. Gavin did not accept that. He left. Marcus already knew the next piece. Gavin called him from the mountain corridor. The conversation had been short because of poor signal and worsening road conditions. Marcus remembered anger, wind, noise, and the one sentence he had repeated to me. Mallory lied to me again. I'm done. Until now, those words had been fragments. Now they had shape. Gavin had not meant he was merely irritated about her car. He had just learned she had manufactured urgency after he had already made the safer decision. I called Marcus later that afternoon, not to ask whether Mom was telling the truth. No single person could certify a 4-year-old memory, as if we were reconstructing security footage. I told him what Mom had said. He listened. Then he gave me something harder. Gavin had not only been tired of Mallory, he had been tired of me making him feel guilty for being tired of her. Marcus did not phrase it cruelly. He did not need to. According to him, Gavin had complained more than once that when he tried to set limits, I acted as though he was withdrawing love from my family. Gavin felt like I made him the cold one, the selfish one, the man who did not understand how hard things were for Mallory. I closed my eyes. There it was. The grievance I could not blame on Dad, or Mom, or Mallory. Mine. I had not forced Gavin up that mountain or made Mallory lie. But long before the final night, my husband had tried to tell me our marriage was carrying responsibilities I had never asked whether he wanted. I had not listened. That failure had a consequence before the crash. Gavin learned to stop bringing the problem to me. I told Marcus the only sentence that did not need qualification. I didn't listen to him. Marcus was quiet for a few seconds. No, you didn't. It hurt. And he did not rush to tell me I had done my best. After we hung up, I went into Gavin's old toolbox in the garage. Not because I expected evidence. There was none. I wanted to remember him somewhere other than a road. Most of his tools had been redistributed years ago, but I had kept a smaller box because getting rid of everything felt too final. A ratchet set, wrenches, 2 screwdrivers with worn handles, a roll of electrical tape that had hardened uselessly around the edges. At the bottom was a plastic wheel from one of Ren's old ride-on toys. I had forgotten it existed. The sight of it pulled up a memory so ordinary I almost laughed. Ren had been too, and furious because one wheel squeaked. Gavin sat cross-legged on the garage floor, fixing it while singing the wrong words to a country song playing from his phone. He always did that. Not accidentally. Once he realized I knew the lyrics, he deliberately changed them until the song became nonsense. Ren kept shouting corrections at him, even though she barely knew the words herself. Bishop had not been part of our home yet. There had been no mystery, no family secret. Just Gavin, grease on one forearm, a plastic wheel between his knees, and our daughter demanding he stop ruining music. I sat on the garage floor with the wheel in my hand and laughed once, then cried. I cried because I missed him. For weeks, the investigation into his final night had threatened to reduce Gavin into a victim attached to a timeline. He had been more than the man Mallory called, more than the husband I failed to hear, more than the body inside a winter crash. He had been a man who sang wrong lyrics because annoying me entertained him. I stayed there until my legs stiffened. Then I put the wheel back. The crash itself did not change. The original investigation still showed a single vehicle loss of control in severe winter conditions, with no evidence of sabotage or another vehicle forcing Gavin off the road. Mallory's lie had put him there. The weather and road had killed him. Those facts could coexist without becoming a cleaner kind of tragedy. Dad had known enough to understand the moral chain. Mom told me that too. After Mallory admitted what she had said to Gavin, Dad's first concern had been what the truth would do to our family. Specifically, to Mallory. Mom remembered his reasoning because she had repeated versions of it herself for years. Mom remembered Dad reducing the whole tragedy to an old family calculation. Aaron could survive grief. Mallory might not survive guilt. He had spent years treating my endurance as a reason I could absorb more pain, and I had helped normalize that division without seeing where it led. Later that evening, Mallory finally called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered. She sounded exhausted, not monstrous. That would have been easier. She said she knew Mom had told me. Most of what followed came in a rush of explanation. The weather had become worse faster than she expected. She had been afraid. Gavin could have chosen not to come. She had never asked him to die for her. I let her speak. There was one sentence she returned to more than any other. I never meant for him to die. I believed her. That was the problem. Mallory kept returning to one defense. I never meant for him to die. I believed that. What I no longer accepted was the idea that intention could erase what a person had chosen to do before the consequence arrived. I did not accuse Mallory of murder. I did not tell her she killed Gavin. The facts did not support that. I told her only that Gavin had made one decision when he knew the truth, and a different one after she changed what he believed. The silence after that felt more honest than anything she had said. When the call ended, I wrote down what still mattered. Learn the truth about Gavin, let the present legal process deal with Pine Ridge, and stop passing our family roles into Wren's life. I no longer needed Gavin's death transformed into a crime it had not been. I needed it returned to him honestly. I stood in Wren's doorway that night. She was asleep with one hand tucked beneath her cheek. Bishop lay on the floor beside the bed, gray muzzle resting on his front paws. The emergency supplies were still near the back door. She had not moved them yet. I thought about Gavin driving toward a person who had made fear sound like danger. Then I thought about my daughter outside Pine Ridge, truly cold, truly stranded, truly waiting for someone to come. The contrast was unbearable. Mallory had spent years making ordinary problems sound urgent enough that someone else would carry them. And when a real emergency finally came, our family had done the opposite. They had minimized it. Just a few minutes. Aaron can handle it. They'll be fine. The same family rule had moved in two directions depending on who needed protection. Mallory's fear became everybody's emergency. My pain became something I was expected to survive. Gavin had been the first person in our adult lives forced to carry the cost of Mallory's panic. Wren had almost become the next. Once I knew what Mallory had told Gavin, the truth felt narrower rather than heavier. For weeks, the empty space had been large enough to hold an affair, a crime, something calculated enough to justify 4 years of silence. What remained was uglier, in a less dramatic way. Mallory had lied because she wanted someone to come. Gavin believed she was in danger, discovered she was not, and died in a winter crash on the way home. Several weeks later, a prosecutor explained the legal boundary in terms that grief did not particularly care for. Mallory's lie helped explain why Gavin was on that road, and why the watch mattered. But there was no evidence she intended his death or controlled what happened after he left the rental. His crash remained an accident. I had known most of that before I walked into the office. Hearing it formally still hurt because some part of me wanted consequence to fit the size of the loss. The law worked from conduct, intent, causation, and what could actually be proved. The meeting itself was almost disappointingly ordinary. I sat with my hands folded while the prosecutor walked through what the evidence could and could not support. There was no promise that law would give Gavin's death a cleaner ending than life had. The anger in that was not about wanting a false charge. It came from realizing that pain and punishment would never line up neatly. Pine Ridge was different. Dad had attended my discharge that morning. He knew my heart was still vulnerable, knew Wren was 7, knew the weather was worsening, put my duffel outside himself, and heard me ask them to take Wren back into the SUV. His defense centered on the claim that he meant to leave us for only 5 minutes before returning. He repeated the number as though precision made the choice safer. Whatever he intended, 5 minutes did not describe what the cold had begun doing to Wren. Mallory could not reduce herself to a passenger either. Wren had tried to get back inside. Mallory shut and locked the rear door, then urged Dad to drive for a few minutes. Mom's role remained different. She had protested leaving Wren outside, but she had also accepted the idea that I needed to cool down, remained in the SUV as it left, delayed calling for help, and softened the first 911 account. Her later cooperation mattered, but it did not make her conduct identical to Dad's or Mallory. The case developed through overlap rather than a smoking gun. 911 timing, Wren's medical record, weather data, our statements, Mom's correction, and the defendant's own partial admissions. Nothing alone proved everything. Together, they gave investigators a sequence they could test, without turning Gavin's death into something it had never been. Wren was not repeatedly interviewed. I insisted on that where I had any choice. The professionals involved seemed to agree. A 7-year-old did not need to rehearse fear until adults felt satisfied that her memory sounded dramatic enough. She had already given the important facts. Grandpa put Mom's bag outside. Auntie shut the door. The car left. She got cold. That was enough for a child to carry. The rest belonged to us. I stopped discussing the case around her. When relatives tried to ask what might happen to Dad or Mallory, I redirected the conversation or ended it. Wren did not need to know possible sentences. She did not need to wonder whether something she said would send Grandpa away. She did not need to become the mechanism through which adults punished one another. She needed to go to school, argue about vegetables, complain that Bishop took up too much space beside the couch, draw 6-legged dogs. The ordinary parts of childhood had started to feel sacred. Marcus understood that better than most people. He came by after one of the legal meetings and found me standing in the kitchen staring at Gavin's watch. I was no longer carrying it everywhere, but I had not yet figured out where it belonged. It sat on the counter beside a fruit bowl, which felt ridiculous enough that Gavin would have mocked me for it. Marcus poured himself coffee and waited. I told him what the prosecutor said about Gavin. He did not look surprised. He had never pushed the idea that Mallory murdered his brother. His anger lived elsewhere. I still admitted to Marcus that I thought about my own judgment in the car. I should have stopped pressing the watch question sooner. He did not tell me I had handled it well, and he did not erase the mistake. He only said that bad judgment and someone else choosing to lock a child out and drive away were separate questions. I could own one without absorbing the other. Mom's correction cost her more than a revised statement. For years, she had arranged truth into shapes that preserved relationships. This time, there was no shape that made everyone comfortable. Dad was furious. Mallory stopped answering her calls, and Mom stayed away rather than return home and rebuild the old version. A week later, Mom formally corrected her statement. She admitted the stop was about the watch, that Dad had put my bag outside, that Wren tried to return, that Mallory closed the door, and that Dad drove while she waited too long to call. The correction cost her the shelter of the shared family version. Dad was furious. Mallory stopped answering her calls, and Mom remained with my aunt. At first, Dad and Mallory's explanations had protected each other. Once attorneys became involved, that stopped working. Dad's side emphasized Mallory's desperation to recover the watch and her instruction to drive. Mallory's side emphasized the facts nobody could transfer away from him. He owned the vehicle, chose the stop, removed my bag, and drove. The split between Dad and Mallory did not feel satisfying from a distance. It felt familiar. Each side was using true facts selectively, trying to make the other person's role look larger. The difference was that neither of them could make my judgment in the car absorb the whole event anymore. I learned about most of that through legal updates rather than witnessing their conversations. What changed was simple. The pressure could no longer be placed entirely on me, so the two people who had protected the same story began protecting themselves. Meanwhile, Wren began improving in ways small enough that outsiders might not notice. She stopped wearing her coat inside Dr. Shaw's office. The emergency supplies remained beside our door, but she no longer checked them every morning. She still watched the weather. She also started complaining again. That may have been my favorite sign. One evening she informed me that the chicken was too healthy, which apparently meant I had used herbs instead of breading. I nearly thanked her. Instead, I told her the chicken would survive the insult. Bishop was stretched beneath the table, asleep so deeply that one back leg twitched. My phone rang. It was a legal update I had been expecting. I stepped into the living room to take it. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes. Most of it involved scheduling, statements, and where the case stood. I listened, took notes, and asked only what I needed. Halfway through, Bishop began snoring. Not lightly. A deep mechanical vibration came from under the dining table, loud enough that the person on the phone paused. Wren appeared in the doorway. She looked at Bishop, then at me. Retirement has very strict nap rules. I covered the phone for a second because the laugh arrived at exactly the wrong time. It was the first legal conversation in weeks that ended without leaving my shoulders against my ears. Life kept doing that. Pain did not stop absurd things from happening. Apparently, neither did felony investigations. The legal call itself contained no final resolution. The important change was that Dad and Mallory were no longer presenting one united account. Mom called later that night. Her voice sounded strained. Mallory had finally understood what Dad's legal position might become. Frank was prepared to say he had stopped at Pine Ridge because Mallory demanded Gavin's watch back. Not merely because I was emotional, not merely because he wanted everyone to calm down, because Mallory wanted the watch. And if necessary, he was prepared to say the decision to drive away happened after she urged him to leave me there for a few minutes. I sat very still. Dad had spent most of Mallory's life stepping between her and consequence. He had hidden Gavin's final night because he believed guilt might destroy her. He had watched me grieve, rather than let Mallory carry the truth. Now the cost of protecting her had become too high. And Frank Calloway was finally doing what our family had always done when consequence became unbearable. He was deciding who else could carry it. This time he was choosing Mallory. Mallory called me 3 days after I learned Dad was preparing to blame her. After weeks of carefully edited messages, the fact that she called instead of writing told me something had changed. Panic had always preferred a voice. I let the phone ring twice. Then I answered. For a few seconds, all I heard was breathing. Not crying. Not yet. She started with Dad. Mallory said Dad's attorney was making her the engine behind Pine Ridge. The account was selective, not invented. Dad had driven and put my bag outside, while Mallory had wanted the watch, shut the rear door and told him to go. Now Dad was enlarging her share of the truth, the same way she had spent years enlarging everyone else's. She wanted me to stop him. Not in those exact words at first. She circled it. She wanted me to tell the attorneys that nobody had intended Wren's hypothermia, that the confrontation had escalated, and that Dad was not the only adult making decisions. I could feel the old reflex beginning: who to call, how to soften the language, how to reduce the damage. But I stayed at the kitchen table and listened. Wren had left for school 10 minutes earlier. Bishop was asleep near the back door, one ear twitching every time the furnace clicked on. Mallory kept talking. Beneath the self-protection, Mallory said something true. Our family had taught her that rescue was what love looked like. Dad fixed things. Mom softened consequences. I came when she called, and eventually Gavin did too. You're right about that part, I said. I had helped teach her that enough fear would bring someone running. Admitting that did not turn it into an acquittal. Mallory's voice softened. For a second, I could hear the younger sister beneath everything else. The girl who called me from a sleepover because she thought everyone hated her. The teenager who sat on the edge of my bed after wrecking Mom's car and asked whether Dad would ever forgive her. She said she did not know how to be the kind of person everyone suddenly expected her to become. A person who handled fear alone. A person who accepted that nobody was coming. That pain was real too. I understood it. Then she asked me to rescue her from it. That was the line. I told her the attorneys did not need my interpretation of her intentions. She had to tell the truth herself. When the line went quiet, I could feel myself searching for softer words. I could have reassured her, explained that boundaries were not punishment, or found some way to make the fear smaller. I let the sentence stand instead. Mallory ended the call sounding hurt rather than angry, and I felt no rush of victory. Leah was one of the first people outside the family to step back. Looking back at her own history with Mallory, she recognized the same pattern in smaller forms: money covered because disaster seemed imminent, late-night rescues, weekends reorganized around a crisis. She did not publicly condemn Mallory. She simply stopped being an emergency solution for problems Mallory could handle through ordinary channels. A few other people became less reachable in the same quiet way. Dad's consequences were quieter too. Mom remained at my aunt's house. She did not file for divorce. She did not turn 40 years of marriage into a sudden declaration that nothing between them had ever been real. She simply refused to go home while Dad insisted everyone should protect one shared story. That left him alone, in a house he had spent decades treating as a command center. I learned small things about Dad's new isolation because Mom mentioned them. An appointment forgotten, a household task missed, a repair he eventually called me about. I watched his name disappear from my screen without answering. The repair remained his problem, and the world did not end. That taught me more than any speech about boundaries could have. Mom's legal path was separating from Dad's and Mallory's. Her corrected statement, delayed 911 call, and first minimization were all part of the negotiations, as was her later cooperation. A lesser resolution involving supervision, counseling, community service, restitution, and restrictions was being discussed. She told me without asking for a letter, leniency, or reassurance. My relationship with Marcus changed in similarly small ways. We had been spending more time together because Ren liked him, and because he had stopped feeling like a person attached only to Gavin's death. One Saturday, he helped me sort through the last boxes in the garage that still belonged to Gavin. Not evidence, just life. A cracked thermos, an old Broncos cap, 3 unmatched work gloves, which felt aggressively like Gavin. A tape measure with his name written in permanent marker because apparently he had once worked with men who believed ownership was a philosophical question. Marcus held it up and shook his head. He wrote his name on everything. He wrote his name on my extension cord. That was because you stole tools. I borrowed tools. We both smiled. The exchange lasted seconds. Then we kept sorting. That was what healing with Marcus began to look like. Not a dramatic reconciliation. Ordinary conversation surviving beside old hurt. At the bottom of one box was a photo of Gavin and Marcus standing beside a half-disassembled lawnmower. Gavin had grease across his forehead. Marcus looked irritated enough that I could almost hear the argument. I remembered that day. Gavin had promised the repair would take an hour. It took 6. He ordered pizza at 4 and declared that technically he had never specified which hour. The memory made Marcus laugh. Then the laughter faded. I told him I owed him an apology. Not for grief. Not for failing to investigate something I had no reason to suspect. For asking him to stop questioning Gavin's route and then letting my own pain erase the fact that he had lost someone too. Marcus looked down at the photograph. I apologized for treating his concern like an attack on my ability to survive. I apologized for making him carry it alone after that. He listened. Marcus did not tell me there was nothing to forgive. He said he had been angry for years and was willing to rebuild without pretending the hurt had never happened. Later, after he went home, I took Gavin's watch upstairs. I had been carrying it too often. Not literally every hour, but close enough that I knew exactly which coat pocket held it, which drawer it occupied at night, how the leather felt beneath my thumb when I became anxious. It had become a physical connection to every question. That was too much weight for an object. I opened the box where I kept Gavin's wedding ring, an old keychain, a few photographs, and the little metal tag Ren had played with as a toddler. I put the watch in the box with Gavin's wedding ring, photographs, and other ordinary belongings. It no longer needed to sit in my pocket as a physical connection to every unanswered question. Ren made her own small change a week later. Her class had a short Saturday program at the nature center, mostly indoor activities with one supervised walk if the weather stayed mild. The first time the permission slip came home, she said she did not want to go. I assumed she was tired. Then she asked whether Bishop could come. He could not. That was when I understood. For months, Bishop had become a portable guarantee. If Bishop was there, someone stayed. If Bishop was there, the world felt harder to leave. I did not tell Wren she was being silly. I asked what part worried her. She stared at the permission slip, being away from him. Then, after a pause, she added, "And you?" She said it plainly. "No, I'm okay." No joke. No pretending she suddenly loved field trips. I wanted to praise her so much that the words crowded against my teeth. Instead, I thanked her for telling me. We made a plan. Nadine would keep Bishop for the morning because I had a cardiac follow-up scheduled near the same time. Marcus would be listed as backup pickup for Wren if anything changed. Wren would know exactly who was coming and when. She still looked nervous. That was allowed. She went. When I dropped Bishop at Nadine's house, Wren hugged him around the neck and gave him instructions as though he were the one prone to poor judgment. Bishop accepted the affection with the long-suffering expression of a dog who had endured military service only to become accountable to a second grader. Marcus watched him settle beside Nadine's kitchen. He retired better than any human I know. Wren shook her head. He still works. Marcus raised an eyebrow. She pointed toward the counter where Nadine was slicing cheese. When cheese happens, Bishop's ears lifted immediately. The laugh came easily. Not because everything was healed, because for 10 seconds, nothing needed healing. Then Wren climbed into my car and went to the program without Bishop. Her hand stayed wrapped around the strap of her backpack for most of the drive. At the entrance, she told me she was nervous. I told her I knew. She went anyway. That morning, I had my own test. Cardiology follow-ups had become less frightening, which created a different problem. Improvement tempted me back toward old habits. My heart rhythm had stabilized well. My exercise tolerance was slowly increasing. Doctor. Ward had begun relaxing some restrictions while reminding me that recovering did not mean returning to the person who ignored symptoms until her body forced the issue. Normally, I would have driven myself, handled Wren's schedule, picked up Bishop, stopped for groceries, and declared the day efficient. Instead, I asked Marcus to pick Wren up if my appointment ran long. I asked Nadine to keep Bishop through lunch. I did it before I became exhausted, not after. There was no emergency. Nobody resented me. Nothing collapsed because I had needed help before reaching the edge. It should not have felt revolutionary. It did. The larger legal fracture kept widening. Dad's side emphasized Mallory's insistence on the watch and her instruction to drive. Hers emphasized that Frank was the father, the driver, and the person who chose to leave. Neither version could protect one without exposing the other. Mallory tried Mom, Leah, and me again. As that alliance broke apart, none of us stepped in. Eventually, she left a short voicemail saying Dad had formally made her role central to his defense. The man who had hidden Gavin's final night to protect her was now willing to describe her actions in the least protective way available if it reduced his own responsibility. The man who had hidden Gavin's last night to protect her was now willing to describe her actions in the least protective way available if it reduced his own responsibility. I listened to the message once, then deleted nothing, kept nothing for evidence. It was already in the hands of lawyers where it belonged. Later, Mom told me Mallory had come to my aunt's house and cried, in a way she had not seen since Mallory was young. The pain was centered on Dad turning against her, not on a sudden understanding of Wren or Gavin, but it was real. Mallory had spent her life believing his protection was unconditional. Now she was learning the hidden condition. He protected her while someone else could carry the cost. I saw her again weeks later, in a courthouse hallway, connected to one of the routine proceedings that required our presence. There was no confrontation, no audience, no family lined up on opposite sides waiting for speeches. Mallory looked thinner than the last time I saw her. She held a paper cup in both hands and kept staring down at it. Dad was farther along the corridor with his attorney. He did not look toward her. That seemed to hurt more than if he had. For several minutes, we occupied the same hallway without speaking. Then Mallory crossed toward me. I stayed where I was, She did not ask me to fix anything this time. She looked past my shoulder at Dad. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that nobody else would have heard unless they were trying. He said he'd always protect me. For most of my life, that sentence would have triggered action, comfort, explanation, some attempt to make fear smaller. This time, nobody moved. Not Mom, not me, not even Mallory. And for the first time, nobody rushed to make that fear go away. By the time the case finally reached resolution, the snow at Pine Ridge had been gone for months. Almost 10 months had passed since Dad drove away. That amount of time sounded impossible when I said it aloud. The storm still lived in my body as something immediate. The sensation of wet denim beneath Wren's knees, the weight of Bishop against us, the red blur of Dad's taillights disappearing around the bend. But ordinary life had kept moving around it. Spring came. Then summer. Wren finished the school year and started another. My heart improved slowly enough that I noticed progress only when I compared myself to the woman who had once needed to sit down after walking from the kitchen to the mailbox. I could drive normally again. I could take longer walks. I could handle most days without arranging my life around fatigue. I still kept cardiology appointments. I still took medication, and when my body told me enough, I had stopped treating the message like an insult. That was harder than recovery itself. Wren had changed too. She no longer kept the emergency water and crackers beside the door, though the flashlight remained in the kitchen drawer where it belonged. She slept through most nights. She went to school without checking 3 times who would pick her up. Weather reports still caught her attention. If snow appeared in the forecast, even a small amount, she wanted to know where we would be, who was driving, and whether Bishop was coming. Doctor. Sean never treated those questions as failures. Healing did not require forgetting why caution had developed. Some habits loosened because Wren felt safer. Others simply became less loud. The case had never depended on one dramatic piece of evidence. By late fall, the 911 timing, medical and weather records, Mom's corrected statement, and the defendant's own admissions had made the sequence difficult to explain away. Their attorneys moved toward negotiated resolutions rather than a theatrical trial. Dad accepted responsibility through a serious felony disposition tied to knowingly or recklessly placing Wren in dangerous conditions and the injury that followed. Dad's role was difficult to minimize. He had chosen the stop, removed my bag, controlled the vehicle, and driven away after hearing me ask them to take Wren back inside. The final sentence included real incarceration measured in years, followed by supervision and financial obligations connected to the harm he caused. I did not memorize the number the way I once thought I would. That surprised me. For months, consequence had existed in my imagination like a scale. If Dad received enough punishment, perhaps the weight would finally move off Wren. It did not work that way. The sentence belonged to Dad. The recovery still belonged to Wren. Mallory's outcome was separate. Mallory's lawyers had emphasized that she was not the driver, but that did not erase her own affirmative choices. She shut and locked the rear door when Wren tried to return, then urged Dad to leave. She eventually accepted a serious felony resolution of her own. Her sentence was not identical to Dad's, because their conduct had not been identical, but it included actual custody, supervision afterward, and restitution obligations. There was something almost unbearably ordinary about hearing the outcome. Mallory sat beside her attorney. Dad sat farther away with his. They barely looked at one another. For most of her life, Mallory had believed Dad would stand between her and consequence. For most of his life as a father, Dad had believed Mallory's fragility justified that. By the end, each had spent months helping the legal system understand why the other person should carry more blame. Neither arrangement protected them from their own conduct. Mom's resolution came later that afternoon. Hers was lighter. It should have been. Mom's part was different. She had protested leaving Wren, yet remained in the SUV, delayed seeking help, and minimized the first 911 account. Her corrected statement and cooperation weighed heavily in the lesser resolution that followed. She accepted a lesser misdemeanor-level outcome with probation, community service, counseling, restitution, and restrictions that prevented her from simply resuming ordinary, unsupervised contact with Ren. Mom did not ask me to intervene. She did not ask the court to treat her cooperation like a gift to me. When everything was finished, she stood several yards away in the hallway with her hands folded around the strap of her purse. For once, she allowed a consequence to belong to her without searching my face for permission to feel better about it. I could respect that. I was not ready to reward it. Those were different things. Gavin remained the strangest absence in the legal resolution. Nothing that happened in court changed the official truth of his death. The crash was still an accident, no matter how much moral responsibility lived around the road that led him there. I had finally accepted that honesty did not guarantee a matching criminal charge. I had submitted a short victim impact statement in the present case. Writing it took me nearly a week. My victim impact statement centered Ren. I wrote about a child who had learned to keep water by the door after adults drove away, and who later hid pain because she believed her mother's heart needed protection. I asked only that what happened to her not be reduced to a family argument that got out of hand. She had been a child caught in adult conflict. I wish I could say I felt satisfaction when the final decisions became official. I felt some relief and even more exhaustion, but victory was not the word. Gavin was still dead. Ren still watched weather reports, and no sentence could warm the turnout retroactively. Consequence mattered. It was not the same thing as repair. Dad and Mallory's relationship remained fractured, and Mallory's rescue network had thinned. Mom did not return home simply because Dad was lonely, and I did not resume organizing his practical life. None of it had been orchestrated as revenge. People had simply stopped absorbing consequences that were not theirs. Marcus sat beside me for part of the final court day. We had reached a point where his presence did not require discussion. He arrived. He sat. He stayed. That had become enough. After the proceedings ended, we stood outside near a concrete planter while people moved around us carrying files, phones, and cups of coffee. Marcus looked tired. So did I. He said legal closure felt smaller than he expected. I understood exactly. Nothing about the afternoon undid Gavin. Nothing restored the years between Marcus and me either. We had rebuilt enough to laugh together again. Enough that he picked Ren up from school sometimes. Enough that he could walk into my kitchen without feeling like a guest. But the old hurt remained part of the structure. I had shut him out. He had resented me. We knew that now. Repair had not required pretending otherwise. The wind caught the edge of his jacket. For a second, I remembered Gavin standing beside him in the old photograph with the broken lawnmower. Two brothers before either knew how expensive family could become. Marcus followed my gaze even though there was nothing there. He'd hate all of this. I almost smiled. Gavin hated paperwork. He once delayed renewing a vehicle registration because he insisted the state had created a form specifically to punish him for being literate. He'd complain about parking first. Marcus laughed. The sound left quickly, but it existed. We went home. Nadine arrived less than an hour later, carrying takeout because she had decided nobody coming home from court should be trusted with a stove. She brought chicken, mashed potatoes, rolls, and enough food for twice the number of people in my kitchen. Ren inspected the containers with serious attention. Bishop inspected them with professional interest. Marcus had followed us back and was attempting to remove lids when Ren noticed him portioning chicken. You forgot Bishop's official share. Marcus looked toward the dog. Bishop was sitting so perfectly upright that his entire military career seemed to have been preparation for this negotiation. I wasn't aware he had an official share. Ren pointed at one piece. That one. Nadine reminded her that Bishop did not get to negotiate human dinner simply because he had once served his country. Ren said she was not negotiating. She was correcting paperwork. I laughed. Marcus handed Bishop a dog-safe piece later, after the rest of us had eaten and Wren had carefully supervised the decision. For a few minutes the kitchen sounded normal. Containers opened, forks tapped plates. Nadine complained that Marcus had taken too much gravy. Wren disagreed with the concept of too much gravy. Bishop rested beneath the table, waiting for civilization to fail in his favor. That ordinary noise did something court never could. It reminded me that our life was not waiting for tragedy to finish before beginning again. Tragedy had become part of it. So had dinner. After Marcus and Nadine left, Wren helped me collect the empty containers. She had grown taller since the storm. I noticed it when she reached the counter without stretching. Children were unfair that way. You could spend months watching them every day and still be startled when a sleeve became too short. She carried 2 plates to the sink and looked at me. "You're quiet." I dried my hands on a towel. I told her it had been a long day. She knew something important had happened. We had not hidden the existence of the case from her. We simply kept adult consequences out of her lap. She asked if Grandpa and Aunt Mallory were in trouble now. I told her the adults responsible for what happened had consequences. That was enough. Wren considered it. Then she climbed onto the chair beside me instead of returning to the living room. Bishop came with her and lowered himself across both our feet. For a moment she watched her hands. Her fingernails were painted uneven blue from a sleepover at a friend's house the weekend before. One thumb had already chipped. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. "Mom," I turned toward her. "Do I have to be strong like you now?" The question went through me more cleanly than anything a judge could have said. Every legal consequence had answered the easier question. Wren was still waiting to know what she was supposed to carry. Part of that lesson came from the people who left us in the snow, and part of it came from me. I did not answer immediately. For once, silence was not avoidance. It was the space required. Before telling the truth. The people who left us in the storm had finally been forced to carry consequences of their own. But the hardest consequence was sitting beside me, waiting to learn what I had taught her about being strong. Wren's question stayed between us. "Do I have to be strong like you now?" For most of my life, I would have known how to answer before she finished asking. I would have told her she already was strong. I would have praised her for surviving the storm, for going back to school, for speaking to Dr. Shaw, for leaving Bishop with Nadine when she was nervous. I would have wrapped the word around her like a medal, because that was how my family had wrapped it around me. Strong meant capable. Strong meant dependable. Strong meant other people did not need to worry about you. I had spent 39 years learning how dangerous a compliment could become when nobody told you what it cost. So I did not praise Wren. I moved from my chair to the couch beside her instead. Bishop lifted his head when I shifted, and then lowered it across our feet again. His body was warm and solid, the familiar weight of something that did not require an explanation. Wren waited. She had asked a simple question. She deserved a simple answer before I turned it into family history. "I taught you a bad habit," I said. Her eyebrows pulled together. I told her that I had spent a long time saying I was fine when I was not. I worked when I should have rested. I kept things inside when I should have asked for help. I let her see me treating pain like something good people were supposed to hide. I did not begin with Dad, Mallory, or Mom. This part belonged to me. That was my mistake. Wren looked down at the chipped blue polish on her thumb. She was quiet long enough that I had to fight the instinct to fill the space. Finally, I asked what being strong meant to her. She rubbed the edge of one fingernail with another. Not crying. I kept listening. And not making people worry. The answer was mine before it belonged to anyone else in the family. Wren added one more thing in a voice barely above the hum of the refrigerator. "Doing stuff yourself." I closed my eyes for half a second. At 7 years old, she had already built the same cage I had spent nearly 4 decades decorating. I did not tell her she was wrong. She had learned exactly what I had demonstrated. I told her there were other kinds of strength. Sometimes, strength was telling someone you were scared before fear became too big to carry. Sometimes it was saying your stomach hurt instead of hiding it. Sometimes it was asking a person to stay. She looked at me. What if they leave? There was Pine Ridge in that question. No amount of healthy parent language was going to make it disappear. I could have promised her I never would. I almost did. Then I thought about the promises our family had made by pretending bad things could be controlled by the right words. I could not promise that nobody would ever leave. People got sick, cars broke, and adults failed. Instead, I gave her something smaller and truer. If you're scared, you can tell me. And if I can't be there, we'll know who is. She already knew some of those people: Marcus, Nadine, her teacher, and Dr. Shaw. Ren leaned against my side. Ren leaned against me, and a few minutes later asked whether there was any chicken left. The conversation ended with reheated takeout and Bishop watching every movement of my fork. Healing that night looked ordinary. 13 months after Pine Ridge, snow appeared in the forecast again. By then it was early 2027, and Ren was 8. She had grown almost 2 inches, lost another tooth, and developed strong opinions about the difference between third-grade homework that was useful and third-grade homework that was just paperwork pretending to be education. I blamed Gavin for that. My heart had improved without returning me magically to the person I had been before myocarditis. I still kept cardiology appointments and respected symptoms I once would have treated as obstacles. Improvement no longer meant permission to ignore limits. The night before the forecasted snow, I found Ren sitting on her bedroom floor with 6 pairs of socks laid out in front of her. 6. I leaned against the doorframe. Planning an expedition? She inspected the socks. I'm improving our odds. I bit the inside of my cheek. A year earlier, excessive preparation would have frightened me. Now I knew the difference between fear silently running her life and Ren announcing that she was nervous, while also being 8 years old enough to believe socks could change weather outcomes. She chose 2 pairs. The other 4 went back in the drawer. She still checked forecasts and preferred knowing who would handle school pickup. But the bottled water no longer lived by the door, and asking for reassurance no longer embarrassed her. She had also become gloriously 8 again. In other ways, doors closed too hard, pencils suffered, and once she informed me, I was very unreasonable for a person who knows the rules. When I refused a movie on a school night, Bishop's silver muzzle had spread toward his eyes, and at 10 he treated stares and naps with the seriousness age required. Ren could now leave him sleeping at home. Safety no longer depended on one dog being physically beside her. It included people she trusted to show up. Marcus became one of them. He did not replace Gavin. Nobody could. He became Uncle Marcus again, instead of the man carrying unanswered questions about his brother. He picked Ren up from school some Thursdays when my work schedule ran late. He showed up with the wrong snacks often enough that she made him a written list. He repaired a cabinet hinge in my kitchen and managed to complain about Gavin's labeling system for 15 minutes, even though Gavin had been dead 5 years by then. Marcus became Uncle Marcus again, steady, warm, and still honest about the past. We did not keep reopening the wound, but neither of us pretended it had never existed. Once, while clearing snow, I told him I wished Gavin had known I finally understood what he had tried to tell me. Marcus rested on the shovel and said only, "He knew you loved him." It did not erase my failure to listen, and I no longer needed it to. Mom completed the requirements tied to her case and waited months before asking to meet me alone. At the meeting, she did not explain Dad or Mallory. She admitted she had repeatedly chosen a version of peace that required me to carry more pain because she believed I could. I listened without offering instant forgiveness, and we agreed to another adult-only meeting. Ren was not a reward for compliance. Whatever repair came next would happen slowly. Dad was serving the custodial portion of his sentence, and I no longer stepped in whenever an ordinary form, appointment, or household problem reached him. He had legitimate channels for help. Discomfort did not make the task mine. Mallory had largely disappeared from my daily life. What I heard suggested she was beginning to handle practical problems through ordinary channels: a mechanic for the car, the proper office for paperwork, arranged transportation when she needed it. I did not know whether that made her wiser. I no longer needed to decide. One Saturday, Ren and I opened Gavin's box together. Not because of the case. She had asked what kind of jokes her dad used to make. That question felt like a gift. For years, Gavin had existed in Ren's mind through photographs and the careful stories adults tell children about parents who died before memory had a chance to become reliable. Your dad loved you. Your dad was funny. Your dad fixed things. All true. Too smooth. So, I told her about the wrong song lyrics, about the 6-hour lawnmower repair, about the time he put his name on my extension cord and then denied having stolen it from me. Marcus contributed stories later. Ren laughed hardest at the one about Gavin trying to repair a dripping faucet and accidentally spraying water across the kitchen ceiling. Bishop had not been living with us then, but Ren decided he would have judged Gavin severely. Probably. Gavin's watch stayed inside the box with his ordinary belongings. Ren knew it was there. She did not ask to wear it. I did not display it. Some objects deserve to become ordinary again. The greatest test of whether I had changed came on a completely unremarkable Tuesday. That seemed appropriate. My car made a grinding sound while I was pulling into the school parking lot. Old Aaron would have done 3 things. Pretended it was nothing, picked Ren up, driven home carefully, while listening for whether the sound became worse. Then tried to solve everything myself after dinner. Instead, I parked. I called a mechanic. Then I called Marcus. I told him exactly what happened and asked whether he could pick Ren up, because I was not driving the car until someone checked it. He could. That was the entire crisis. No one panicked. No one called the problem selfish. No one praised me for handling everything. The mechanic found a brake issue that was annoying, but repairable. Marcus picked Ren up. Nadine brought us home later. Life continued. That night, after 2 ordinary requests for help had solved an ordinary problem, I noticed how uneventful change could be. The first significant snow of that winter arrived in February. Not a blizzard, not Pine Ridge, but enough. Heavy flakes started before sunset and covered the yard faster than the forecast had suggested. By dinner, the street had softened under several inches of white. Ren went quiet when she noticed. I saw it before she said anything. Her spoon stopped halfway between the bowl and her mouth. She looked toward the window. Bishop raised his head beneath the table. A year earlier, I might have rushed to reassure her. Roads are fine. We're home. Nothing is going to happen. Instead, I waited. Ren set the spoon down. I'm scared. 3 words. No apology. No smile afterward to prove she was okay. I reached across the table. She took my hand. We checked the practical things together. We were home. The heat was working. Phones were charged. Nadine lived nearby. Marcus knew the forecast and had already sent a message saying he was staying home. There was food. No one needed to drive anywhere. I did not promise snow could never hurt us again. I gave Ren something better than a promise. A plan. Later, we stood at the front window. Bishop came slowly from the living room and sat beside us. He did not press himself between Ren and the glass. She did not clutch his collar. He was simply there. By choice. Ren's hand remained in mine. Snow covered the walkway where, months earlier, Marcus and I had cleared a smaller storm. Streetlights turned the falling flakes gold at the edges. For the first time since Pine Ridge, snow was only weather again. Not entirely. Maybe it never would be. But enough. Ren leaned against my arm. I thought about the woman I had been before all of this, the soldier who believed endurance was proof of worth, the daughter praised because nobody needed to worry about her, the wife who heard her husband asking for a boundary and mistook it for lack of compassion, The mother who hid sickness until her body collapsed, then watched her daughter begin doing the same thing in miniature. I had spent years believing strength meant remaining useful, while everyone else fell apart. Wren did not need that inheritance. The snow kept falling. She squeezed my hand once. I did not tell her she was brave. I did not tell her she was strong. I thanked her for telling me she was scared. Bishop lowered himself carefully onto the rug beside us, old joints taking their time. Behind us, my phone buzzed with a message from Marcus checking in. Another followed from Nadine. 2 people. No emergency. Just showing up. I looked at Wren and understood how different our lives had become. Loyalty was no longer one exhausted person refusing to fall. It was a network. People who answered. People who told the truth. People who allowed one another to need things without turning need into control. For most of my life, being the strong one meant everyone else got to fall apart while I stayed standing. I was not teaching Wren that. When the snow came again, she reached for my hand not because she believed I could survive anything, but because she knew she would never have to survive it alone.